They ruled empires, shaped history, and were absolutely weird. From kings who knighted vegetables to queens who feared sneezes were satanic, this is not your textbook monarchy. Forget polished portraits and royal speeches. Behind the crowns were obsessions, tantrums, ghost-haunted diaries, and armor made of diamonds. These are the 101 strangest, funniest, most unhinged facts about English kings and queens you've never heard. So buckle your doublet, pour some pheasant gravy, and prepare for a 2-hour plunge into royal madness. This is the 101 weirdest facts about English kings and queens. And yes, someone really did talk to cows. Before we dive headfirst into royal insanity, make sure to subscribe because we've got a whole empire of strange history coming your way. And hey, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you sipping tea at noon or doom scrolling at 3 a.m. in your pajamas? We want to know who's joining us on this weird, majestic ride. Henry VIII owned over 50 pairs of velvet slippers. In the golden maze of Hampton Court, where sycophants whispered and chandeliers trembled with gossip, one monarch clomped through history in style, Henry VIII, a man whose feet were more pampered than most noblemen's entire lives. He owned over 50 pairs of velvet slippers, not leather, not silk, velvet. The kind of footwear that whispers, "divine right," with every plush step. But Henry was no common shoe horderno. He refused to wear the same pair twice in a week. This was a king who changed wives like outfits and slippers like moods. Imagine the royal wardrobe, racks upon racks of decadent foot pillows, each a silent witness to his temper tantrums, his feasts, his increasingly heavy gait. Courtiers probably feared the shuffle of velvet more than the clink of chains, because if Henry was walking toward you, something was about to get executed. His slipper obsession wasn't just vanity, it was monarchy in motion. Every pair a declaration. I am above you. I am comfort incarnate. I am king, even in socks. And speaking of fear, next up, meet a monarch who could hold her own against the Spanish Armada but nearly fainted at 4 tiny paws. Queen Elizabeth I was terrified of mice. She wore armor over silk, commanded ships with a stare, and turned virginity into policy. But set a mouse loose in the Privy Council, and Queen Elizabeth I would leap like a commoner on a chair. Once, during a heated session with her advisors, a mouse scurried across the room. The Virgin Queen did not maintain regal composure. She screamed, loudly. The counselors froze, not from the mouse, but from fear that laughter might cost them their heads. This was a woman who crushed rebellion, executed rivals, and rewrote royal image into myth. Yet here she was, paralyzed by a whiskered intruder. It wasn't the only time either. According to gossip, and there was always gossip, Elizabeth ordered entire wings of her palace checked for rodent infiltration. She even had her kitchens inspected by men who'd rather be plotting naval battles than chasing mice with brooms. Royal terror wasn't supposed to squeak, but that's the thing about monarchy, it's all mask and myth, until the tiniest crack lets reality scurry in. But if Elizabeth's fear was irrational, wait until you meet a king who thought branches were royalty, and not metaphorically. King George III tried to shake hands with a tree. At the peak of his madness, when even court physicians began writing more prayers than prescriptions, King George III approached a tree, bowed deeply, and extended his hand, not as a gardener, not as a botanist, but as a fellow monarch. He believed the tree was the King of Prussia. The courtiers didn't blink. They couldn't. Madness was dangerous, but acknowledgement was worse. So they watched in polite horror as George carried on a one-sided diplomatic exchange with bark and leaves. The tree, to its credit, remained dignified. George's mental health deteriorated in brilliant, terrifying flashes. He babbled in Latin, gave speeches to livestock, and tried to redesign the calendar. But nothing said, "The monarchy is unwell," like trying to negotiate foreign policy with a maple. It wasn't entirely his fault. Medicine back then included leeches, arsenic, and moral restraint. The crown stayed on his head long after his mind had drifted off the throne. But while George spoke to trees, another king was getting far more physical with furniture. And unlike diplomacy, this next fact wasn't happening in the palisade, was happening in Paris, in velvet, in secret. Edward VII had a custom-made sex chair in Paris. While polite society clinked teacups and rehearsed etiquette, Edward VII was indulging in upholstery of a different sort. In the hidden chambers of a Parisian pleasure, Palace Les Chabanèches commissioned a throne that no history book dared sketch, a custom-made sex chair. Designed to support his royal girth during affairs of the flesh, the apparatus was more engineering marvel than furniture. Brass fittings, padded supports, and ergonomic angles. Edward's appetite for women required hydraulics. He was known as Dirty Birdie in polite whispers, and the moniker didn't come from muddy boots. Married? Yes. Faithful? Absolutely not. His visits to Paris were less statecraft, more acrobatics. The sex chair allowed him to how should we say, participate enthusiastically without the nuisance of cardio. Prostitutes reportedly loved him. He was generous, charming, and unfazed by scandal. The chair still exists. Preserved like a weird religious relic of Victorian hypocrisy, it reminds us that the same empire that birthed Dickens also birthed royal indulgence with brass handlebars. But speaking of strict moral codes, let's swivel from velvet debauchery to velvet paranoia. The next queen couldn't handle a piano leg without getting flustered. Queen Victoria insisted piano legs be covered. In a time when showing ankle was practically pornographic, Queen Victoria upped the prudish ante. She demanded that piano legs be covered because they were, in her eyes, too suggestive. Yes, piano legs. Ornate wooden scrollwork curved into innocent claw feet suddenly deemed risque in the royal gaze. The Victorian era wasn't just repressed, it was artistically repressed. Every household followed suit. Furniture was draped in frilly modesty like an overdressed aunt. Even inanimate objects weren't safe from moral scrutiny. Curtains on chair legs, doilies on doilies. Heaven forbid someone catch a glimpse of an uncovered bench limb and have impure thoughts. But Victoria's fear wasn't just about appearance, it was about control. The empire had to project order, decency, superiority, and so even a Steinway's legs had to wear trousers. In a palace, beauty bowed to shame. Yet while Victoria was draping mahogany in embarrassment, her predecessor had the opposite problem. His love for animals bordered on madness, and when one misbehaved, the court learned quickly. The dog stayed. You didn't. Charles II banned people from kicking his dog. At court, Charles II's spaniels roamed the halls like they owned the place. Technically, they did. Royal courtiers could lose status or favor over one misstep, especially if that misstep landed on a dog. Charles II adored his pets with a zeal usually reserved for heirs. His favorite spaniels defecated in throne rooms, barked during audiences, and occasionally snatched food off banquet tables. Courtiers gritted their teeth and smiled, because one thing you did not do was kick the king's dog. Charles issued an explicit order banning it. And not just a slap-on-the-wrist law. This was a royal decree, as binding as tax policy. The dogs wore ribbons, Some had titles. They sat beside Charles on state business, nuzzling elbows during discussions of war and diplomacy. A visiting ambassador once commented that it was hard to tell whether he was speaking to the King of England or his lapdog. In a court fueled by gossip and petty rivalries, the spaniels were untouchable. You could insult a duke and recover, touch a dog, and you were out. But while Charles defended his dogs like royalty, the next queen had a very different outlet for emotional release. Her dolls weren't playthings, they were victims. Mary I collected, dolls of Protestant martyrs. To her enemies, she was Bloody Mary. But even those who feared her burning stake policies didn't know what she did behind closed doors. Deep in her private chambers, Queen Mary I kept dolls, dozens of them. These weren't toys or courtly ornaments, they were stand-ins, representations, effigies of Protestant martyrs. And she stabbed them. Each was dressed with disturbing care. Tiny robes, miniature Bibles. Some said she named them after real victims. Others whispered she talked to them before delivering pin stabs to their hearts. It wasn't policy, it was penance. Or perhaps pleasure. No one dared ask. This was no innocent hobby. It mirrored the Queen's grim obsession with purging England of heresy. Over 280 Protestants burned during her reign, and yet she still needed these waxen companions to take more punishment. They were her stress relief, her devotional outlet, her twisted gallery of retribution. In a court already rattled by flames and fear, her dolls were a quieter terror. One that didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't bleed, just absorbed her wrath in silence. But not all kings hid their superstition behind curtains. One openly handed power over to the stars and let destiny rule the throne. And that's only number 7. If a king talking to a tree doesn't make you question the whole royal bloodline, just wait, it's about to get wilder. While you're here spiraling with us through history's most bizarre rabbit hole, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next crown-clad catastrophe. And hey, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you in London at lunchtime or in Manila at midnight? Drop it in the comments. We're building a global court of weirdos. Henry VI, let astrologers make state decisions. When the crown grew heavy and his nerves grew thin, Henry VI looked not to generals, ministers, or even God, but to the stars, literally. He surrounded himself with astrologers who advised him on everything from taxes to troop movements. Solar eclipses were omens, comets were declarations, and planetary alignments, practically executive orders. During his reign, political policy sometimes came from a horoscope scroll rather than Parliament. Advisors rolled their eyes in private but nodded solemnly in court. After all, this was a king so fragile he once fell into a catatonic state for over a year. So if Jupiter rising in Virgo helped him decide which town to fund or which noble to marry off, so be it. The court learned to frame their arguments in celestial logic. The harvest is poor, Your Majesty, but Mars assures us better crops. It was less about truth and more about phrasing. If the stars spoke, Henry obeyed. But kings who drift into mysticism tend to become caricatures. And the next one? Well, he was a chain-smoking, contradiction-denouncing sin with a pipe in his hand. James I smoked constantly, despite calling tobacco barbarous. James I hated tobacco, absolutely loathed it, called it barbarous, loathsome, and harmful to the brain. He even published an entire essay, Counterblast to Tobacco, where he ranted about its foul stench and moral decay. So naturally, he smoked like a chimney. This king wasn't just a hypocrite. He was an addict with a flair for royal contradiction. He'd puff away on long clay pipes between diatribes, his court coughing in passive-aggressive silence. Ministers learned to tolerate it, guests learned to pretend it didn't smell like a burning barn, and servants scurried to keep his tobacco stash full. James saw himself as a moral reformer, a God-appointed guardian of public virtue. But somehow, that didn't extend to his own lungs. Maybe he liked the fire in it. Maybe he liked the ritual. Or maybe he just liked being the only one allowed to be disgusting in the palace. But James's hypocrisy was only skin deep. The next royal had to be sewn into his clothes just to function because his addiction wasn't tobacco. It was everything. George IV drank so much he had to be sewn into his trousers. By the end of his life, George IV wasn't so much a monarch as a walking contradiction stitched into velvet and regret. His drinking was legendary biblical, even. Champagne at breakfast, brandy with lunch, and wine to top off a nightcap that started before sunset. It wasn't casual excess. It was full-blown, industrial-scale alcoholism. And the consequences clung to him literally. He grew so bloated from years of indulgence that his valet had to sew him into his trousers before public appearances. Not fasten, not button, sew. Like a costume, like a prize pig dressed for pageantry. The garments didn't just contain his girth, they restrained it, forced it into a shape vaguely resembling royalty. Tailors were sworn to secrecy, buttons were ornamental lies. His wardrobe was more illusion than clothing, but no amount of stitching could hide the fact that the king's liver was plotting a rebellion of its own. Despite it all, he insisted on appearing dignified, a living paradox, bloated, powdered, barely mobile but determined to seem regal, because kings don't sweat, they glisten. And while George was drinking himself into his wardrobe, another king was reigning in name, only spending more time on horseback than on English soil. Richard the Lionheart spent less than 6 months in England. He's remembered as the crusading warrior king, the lion-hearted legend. Statues were raised, stories etched him into myth. But the truth? Richard the Lionheart didn't care much for England. In fact, he spent less than 6 months there during his entire 10-year reign. To him, England was a piggy bank place to tax and plunder to fund his true passion. War. Crusades in the Holy Land, skirmishes in France, sieges, swords, glory that was Richard's throne. Not the chilly island he technically ruled. He barely spoke English. He hated the weather. And when he finally did show up, it was usually just to ask for more money. He left the actual ruling to others often disastrously. While Richard was out charging into destiny, his kingdom descended into debt and instability. Rebellions simmered. Nobles schemed. But the king's sword hand was busy elsewhere. And still, we remember him with lion statues and heroic epithets. Proof that charisma can outshine absence, at least in bronze. But while Richard roared from afar, another queen was mumbling at home through what many suspected was a haze of royal intoxication. Queen Anne was rumored to be drunk during royal audiences. Queen Anne, the monarch of gout and grief, ruled with a swollen leg and a wine glass rarely out of reach. Court whispers said she slurred her words during state audiences, nodded off mid-sentence, and forgot entire diplomatic briefings. Whether she was drunk or simply dazed from illness, no one could say for certain. But her speech often flowed like molasses and smelled like sherry. It wasn't just gossip. Ambassadors noted her heaviness of demeanor and the clouded mind behind her pale, puffy face. Servants carried her between rooms. Ministers repeated things twice, sometimes 3 times. And during one famously awkward meeting, she reportedly tried to bless a visiting dignitary by sneezing on him. Anne was a tragic figure, not a tyrant. 17 pregnancies, 0 surviving heirs, a body that failed her, a throne that exhausted her, And so, if the goblet helped her sit through another day of dull ministers and backstabbing courtiers, who could blame her? But while Anne drank to forget, the next king had a furry advisor he'd never forget because he believed it could outthink Parliament. Edward VIII had a dog named Disraeli, which he claimed was smarter than most politicians. Edward VIII had a flair for dramatics, a taste for scandal, and a dog he swore could outwit half the cabinet. The terrier's name? Disraeli. A four-legged shade thrown at the entire British political class. While Edward was busy derailing the monarchy over love, dodging responsibility, and alienating just about everyone in power, his true confidant wasn't a minister, it was a mutt. He paraded Disraeli through palaces, posed with him in portraits, and dropped quips that made courtiers wince. "Smarter than most MPs," he'd mutter while scratching the dog's ears. "More loyal than my advisors," he'd joke with a bitter smile. Everyone laughed nervously. But the comparison wasn't just a throwaway joke. Edward didn't trust politicians. He thought them self-serving, slow and spineless. Disraeli at least never plotted against him. The dog never wrote treacherous memos or leaked gossip to the press. He simply listened. In a life spiraling out of royal control, Disraeli was something simple, pure, probably housebroken, which is more than could be said for Edward's handling of the crown. But if Edward's insult was metaphorical, the next Queen's list was Literala Kill List, updated in red ink by the hand of England's most dangerous virgin. Elizabeth I kept a kill list. The court of Elizabeth I shimmered with gold and ceremony, but beneath the lace and Latin prayers, the Queen kept something far darker. A handwritten kill list. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't strategic. It was personal. Names written in red ink, updated regularly. Each entry a quiet death sentence hanging in limbo. Whispers claimed she'd review it like a diary, after long councils, after bad news, after betrayal. Her enemies real and imagined lined up like candles waiting to be snuffed. Some names were crossed out. Pardoned, or simply eliminated. Others had red marks beside them, growing heavier with time. A skull beside one, a dagger beside another. This wasn't paranoia, it was policy wrapped in performance. Elizabeth's enemies had a habit of dying in silence, behind closed doors, or on elegant scaffolds surrounded by pomp. Her kill list wasn't a secret, but it wasn't official either. Like everything about her, it danced between myth and menace. And while Elizabeth wielded red ink like a scalpel, the next king met a red death of his own chest, pierced not by politics, but by a very suspicious accident in the woods. William II was accidentally shot in the chest by his own hunting partner. It was supposed to be a casual hunt in the New Forest, royal leisure, nobles, arrows, and deer. But instead, King William I, known as Rufus, was found, sprawled on the forest floor, an arrow through his chest, fired supposedly by his hunting companion, Sir Walter Tyrrell. An accident, they said. A tragic misfire. But no one really believed it. William's death was too convenient, too neat. He was unpopular, quarrelsome, and had no wife or heirs. His sudden exit cleared the path for his brother Henry, who just so happened to seize the crown the very next day, without delay, without mourning. Sir Walter? He fled. Immediately disappeared into France, never to return. Not exactly the actions of a guiltless man weeping over a tragic mistake. The forest held its secrets. No trial, no investigation, just silence and a king buried in haste. Over the centuries, theories have multiplied. A conspiracy, a political assassination, even divine punishment. But one fact remains. An English king went out not on a throne, but face down in mud, with an arrow where no royal crest belonged. And if William's treasure was spilled with blood, the next monarch would lose his entirely to a swamp, along with England's gold, forever. King John lost all his royal treasure in a swamp, where it still remains lost. In 1216, King John was already having the worst year of his life. Barons rebelled, France invaded, his reputation already rotting from tyranny and failed Warsaws, sliding into full collapse. But then came the final humiliation. While fleeing rebellious forces through the Wash, a tidal estuary in eastern England, he made a critical error. He sent his baggage train ahead of him. That train wasn't just tents and chamber pots. It carried the crown jewels, sacks of gold, relics, and the symbolic power of the monarchy itself. Somewhere in the shifting, treacherous marshland, the cart sank, swallowed by the tide. Gone. No bodies, no treasure, just slime, silence, and a stunned royal court. For centuries, treasure hunters have dreamed of finding it. The English crown never officially recovered. The Losner explained it. Some say it was sabotage. Others, divine retribution for John's cruelty. Whatever the truth, the mud closed over more than just jewels. It buried the last dignity of a king already hated by history. John died shortly after, raving and poisoned by dysentery. And while his treasure dissolved into myth, his successor would wage war not on rebels or France, but on the very idea of music. Henry VII hated music so much he fined a man for singing too loudly. Henry VIII wasn't flamboyant like his son, Henry VIII. He wasn't poetic, indulgent, or interested in spectacle. He was a taxman in a crown, quiet, calculating, and apparently deeply allergic to song. He despised music with a puritanical intensity that bordered on comic. Once, a man was fined simply for singing too loudly near court. This wasn't about bad pitch. It was about control. Henry saw music as a waste, a distraction, something that encouraged frivolity when he wanted obedience. The court, that once danced for joy under Plantagenet rule, became a silent stage under Tudor austerity. Musicians whispered, bards played in corners, some gave up entirely. If a harp twanged too brightly in a corridor, heads turned not in delight, but in fear. The merrymaking that had once defined court life now felt like trespassing. All joy had to be sanctioned, tamed. Ironically, his son would become one of the most musically obsessed monarchs in history. But Henry VII left a legacy of silence, broken only by whispers of coins and the shuffle of wary feet. Yet while he fined men for melody, another queen mourned in melodrama. Her sorrow dressed in black Avon for a dog. Queen Victoria dressed her dog in black mourning clothes after it died. When Queen Victoria loved, she grieved just as hard. The death of her husband, Prince Albert, shattered her. She wore black for decades, spoke to his photograph daily, and ordered the palace to remain in mourning as though time itself had stopped. But her ritual of sorrow wasn't limited to humans. When her favorite dog died, she had it dressed in black mourning clothes, not draped, dressed. Tailored garments of grief for a creature that once warmed her lap. Servants were instructed to carry the tiny canine corpse with solemn ceremony. It was placed in a miniature coffin, mourned, remembered. This was more than eccentricity. For Victoria, the boundaries between ritual and obsession dissolved completely. The dog symbolized loyalty in a world where few could be trusted. And so it was honored, as if it had worn medals or signed treaties. She even kept mourning attire for her other pets: curtains, collars, ribbons of jet. It was all part of a personal empire built on grief. And no one dared question it not unless they wanted to join the deceased in spirit. But if Victoria mourned with ceremony, the next king couldn't even communicate with his court because he never bothered to learn their language. George I ruled England while only speaking German. When George I arrived in England in 1714, he stepped off the boat as king and couldn't speak a word of English, not a phrase, not a greeting, not even a toast. His reign began not with fanfare, but with translators. Lots of them. Originally from Hanover, George I ascended to the British throne through a convoluted Protestant succession crisis. Parliament needed a Protestant monarch more than a relatable one. So, they got a German prince who didn't know his people, their language, or their customs. Cabinet meetings were awkward pantomimes. Court dinners turned into games of charades. Ministers used Latin or French, and still, everything got lost in translation. He relied heavily on his advisors, especially Robert Walpole, who effectively ran the country while George nodded politely, likely unsure what was happening. His own courtiers resented him. The people mocked him. Newspapers printed German-sounding gibberish as fake royal quotes, and Yeth ruled. Stranger still, his disinterest in direct rule helped shape the modern British constitutional monarchy. By saying almost nothing, he changed everything. But while George I stumbled through language barriers, another king would vanish into obscurity only to resurface centuries later beneath asphalt and oil stains. Richard III's corpse was found under a parking lot 500 years after his death. For half a millennium, Richard III was more ghost than king. His reputation blackened by Shakespeare, his memory reduced to a hunchbacked villain who murdered nephews, but his actual body vanished. Lost in the chaos of battle and burial. Then, in 2012, construction workers digging under a car park in Leicester unearthed a skeleton with a twisted spine and battle wounds. DNA confirmed it. Richard III had been hiding under a parking lot. He was the last English king to die in battle struck down at Bosworth Field in 1485, and his enemies buried him hastily in a friary later demolished. As centuries passed, no one knew exactly where he'd gone. Urban sprawl swallowed the site, layer by layer, until his grave sat beneath parked Toyotas and oil leaks. When archaeologists found the remains, it was a national sensation. Here was a man who'd become more myth than monarch, finally yanked into the daylight. His bones bore brutal evidence of his end: head trauma, blade marks, humiliation. He was reburied with full royal honors in 2015, from battlefield disgrace to cathedral majesty. But while Richard's bones were hidden, Henry VIII's meals were anything but, especially the regal bird he refused to share with peasants. Henry VIII ate swan regularly and considered turkey too common. Feasts under Henry VIII were less meals and more performance art. He didn't just eat, he consumed. He conquered the banquet table like it owed him a crown. And one bird graced that table more than any other, the swan. Regal, graceful, untouchable, except when roasted. Swan was reserved for nobility, and Henry took that rule personally. He had it prepared with spices from across the empire, glazed until golden and often served whole, feathers reattached for dramatic flair. It wasn't just food, it was dominance on a platter. But turkey? That bird was new, common, a colonial upstart. To Henry, eating turkey was like wearing burlap to court. He scoffed at it, dismissed it. It belonged to merchants, not monarchs. So while the rest of Europe gradually welcomed the bird into their kitchens, Henry stayed loyal to the swan, graceful in water, majestic in death, and apparently delicious when basted in clove butter. Servants handled them like relics. Cooks competed to perfect the royal recipe. and if anyone dared suggest poultry of a lesser pedigree, they might find themselves out of a job or worse. But as Henry feasted on elegance, another queen marched to war with something far more delicate tucked under her arm: porcelain dolls. Mary II loved collecting porcelain dolls, which she carried with her even to war camps. Mary II ruled as co-monarch alongside her husband William III, facing revolutions, threats of invasion, and the never-ending churn of courtly politics. But, despite commanding armies and navigating a kingdom in flux, Mary carried with her something achingly fragile: porcelain dolls, dozens of them, wherever she went, including military camps. These weren't idle trinkets or symbols of lost childhood. They were sacred objects to her, clad in miniature gowns, carefully combed, cradled in velvet-lined boxes. Soldiers looked on, baffled, as the queen, who oversaw battle plans, spent quiet moments dressing dolls. It wasn't just sentimentality. It was ritual, obsession, and perhaps a coping mechanism for a woman who had to be steel on the outside while unraveling inside. Mary's dolls had names, personalities. She spoke to them. Some believed she used them to rehearse court behavior. Others thought they were linked to superstitions of protection. Whatever the reason, they came with her over muddy roads, through gunpowder air, right into the tents of campaign. And while Mary clung to childhood porcelain, the next king was a literal giant so tall his nickname was a measurement, and his walking stick a sharpened weapon. Edward I was so tall, they called him Longshanks. He reportedly used a spear as a walking stick. Edward I wasn't just tall, he was towering. In a medieval world of stunted nutrition and short stature, he loomed above courtiers like a cathedral over a chapel. His legs were so long, they earned him the nickname Longshanks. Not a poetic flourish, but a blunt description. He was a monarch you could see coming from 2 corridors away. Reports claim he used a spear as a walking stick, not for show, but because it matched his reach. This wasn't a man who needed to command a room. His shadow did it first. Towering at around 6'2" or more, he might not sound NBA tall by modern standards, but for the 13th century, he was a giant. His height fed his myth. He was aggressive, uncompromising, and militaristic. Whether crusading in the Holy Land or crushing rebellions in Wales and Scotland, he moved like a weapon of monarchy, unyielding, long-striding, and relentless. Even his tomb reflects his enormity. His bones confirmed what legend whispered. Longshanks was not just tall in body, but in reputation. And while he cut a fierce silhouette, his descendant would become obsessed with something far less fearsome: his own flowing locks. Charles I was obsessed with his hair and owned hundreds of combs. Charles I believed in divine right. He believed in ceremony, formality, and the unquestionable authority of kings. But above all, he believed in his hair. It was long, lustrous, carefully parted and perfumed. He treated his locks like a crown of their own, pampered, protected, and endlessly groomed. He owned hundreds of combs: ivory, tortoiseshell, mother of pearl. Some were engraved with monograms, others rumored to be dipped in oil of rose or myrrh. He brushed it multiple times a day, and if a courtier looked less than impressed, that courtier would not be seen again for a while. His court became a stage, and his mane the star. Even in imprisonment, facing execution, Charles worried aloud about who would style his hair on the scaffold. On the day of his beheading, he requested a hat that wouldn't flatten it. The executioner's axe may have taken his head, but not before the man made sure he looked divine to the end. And while Charles combed away his fate, the next queen smeared death on her face, daily layering beauty with poison in pursuit of the perfect pale. Queen Elizabeth I used lead-based white makeup, which ate away at her skin. To rule as a woman in the 16th century, Elizabeth I needed more than political cunning. She needed to become a symbol, and that symbol had to be flawless, immortal, white as marble and untouchable as the moon. To achieve this ghostly ideal, she turned to Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic blend of white lead and vinegar. It made her skin glow. It also slowly killed her. She painted it on thick, layer after layer. To hide blemishes, yes, but also to sculpt an image. Virgin, divine, eternal. Over time, the lead leached into her skin, causing corrosion, sores, and decay, but Elizabeth doubled down. The worse her skin got, the thicker the mask. Underneath the myth of Gloriana was a woman peeling away behind powder. She would sometimes sit for hours as her ladies carefully applied the toxic mixture, smoothing over each wrinkle, every sign of humanity. Even her closest advisors rarely saw her unpainted face. She had become her own statue. But while Elizabeth painted herself into legend, the next king turned a tiny mole into divine policy, believing his skin bore not sin, but sanctity. James II believed his mole was holy and had it blessed by a priest. James II wasn't exactly known for subtlety. He converted to Catholicism in a Protestant country. He pushed divine right until the monarchy cracked. And in the strangest display of royal ego, he believed a mole on his body was a sacred signproof that he was touched by God. So what did he do? He had it blessed by a priest. Not privately, not sheepishly, ceremonially. This wasn't a quirky superstition. It was theology, rewritten on skin. His inner circle reportedly treated the mole with reverence. Courtiers spoke of it in hushed tones. Some even claimed it looked like a cross. Others said it bled during moments of political stress like a divine barometer of tension. It became a kind of relic in motion, not enshrined in a cathedral, but on the body of a man who saw himself as England's chosen monarch, no matter how much England disagreed. In the end, James's faith in signs couldn't save him. He was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. But for a brief, bizarre chapter, one mole became the most over-promoted patch of skin in British history. And if James's mole was revered in life, the next king would meet death in the most undignified room imaginable, face down on the royal toilet. George II died on the toilet from an aortic rupture. George II was not a dramatic man. He preferred punctuality, routine, and roast beef, but his death was anything but ordinary. On the 25th of October, 1760, he walked into his lavatory after breakfast and never walked out. Moments later, a loud thud echoed through Kensington Palace. The king was found collapsed on the floor, face down, beside the royal commode. An aortic rupture had killed him instantly. A burst artery, one final, fatal heartbeat. The scene was ghastly. His breakfast-boiled eggs and coffee still sat on the table, his wig slightly askew, his dignity left behind. For a monarch who lived by schedule and protocol, it was an undignified exit, but also strangely fitting for a man known for bluntness and little patience for flair. His physicians, scrambling for explanations, wrote long reports about aneurysms and cardiac failure. But the public didn't need the details. The king had died on the toilet. That was enough to immortalize him in pub jokes and scandal sheets for centuries. Still, George's bathroom demise pales in comparison to what terrified the next king. It wasn't illness or rebellion, or even death. It was something far more innocent, a feline with whiskers. William III was terrified of cats, and once jumped out of bed when one entered his chambers. William III wasn't the kind of monarch who rattled easily. He faced assassination plots, brutal winters, and multiple wars without flinching. But the one thing that could send him literally flying from his bed in a panic? Cats. Yes house cats. Whiskers, meows, the occasional indifferent stare. To William, they were miniature monsters. Once, during a late-night moment of calm in his royal chambers, a cat slipped under the door. Not a tiger, not a lynx, just a cat. The king bolted upright and hurled himself from bed in sheer terror, reportedly still wrapped in royal nightwear. Servants rushed in, thinking there was an intruder, only to find His Majesty cowering behind a curtain, pointing at the feline like it was an armed assassin. No one's sure where the phobia began. Perhaps he was scratched as a child. Perhaps he simply couldn't bear the way they seemed to judge him silently. Whatever the cause, palace staff learned quickly. Keep the corridors clear of cats or risk royal meltdown. And while William fled from tiny predators, the next queen embraced intimacy to an extreme, requiring nightly help undressing, long past the age when most people dress themselves. Queen Victoria had a personal servant undress her each night, even in her 70s. Queen Victoria ruled an empire that stretched across continents, but behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, she clung tightly to routine, tradition, and human touch. Every night, well into her 70s, she required a personal servant to undress her. Not for opulence, but out of ritual, dependence, emotion. This wasn't a simple matter of loosening corsets. It was a solemn, silent ceremony. The servant, often a hand-picked lady or trusted maid, would carefully unpin the queen's mourning garments, fold them just so, remove jewelry, comb her hair, and finally lay out her nightgown. Victoria would say little, but the air hung heavy with memory of Albert, of loneliness, of decades spent in black. It was more than royal formality. It was intimacy, sustained by hierarchy. She didn't want servants, she wanted witnesses. People to mark the quiet hours, to confirm she still existed beneath the crown. Even as her joints stiffened and her eyesight failed, she never once requested privacy. In her mind, a queen did not change for bed, she was prepared for it. But if Victoria undressed with ceremony, her ancestor had to be lifted into his trousers because his waistline had become a feat of architectural engineering. Henry VIII's waist ballooned to over 50 inches, and he needed a crane to lift him onto his horse. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was less a man than a siege tower in royal robes. His waist, once tightly cinched by armor and vanity, ballooned past 50 inches. Walking became a strain. Standing, a chore. And riding? Impossible without machinery. So the court installed a special hoist-a-royal crane, not metaphorically, literally. A device was rigged in his private stables to lift the enormous king onto horseback like a cargo crate. Straps, pulleys, servants grunting in unison. Imagine the whispers, the heaving, the awkward silence as His Majesty was slowly dangled above his saddle like a roast being lowered into an oven. And still, Henry clung to the image of the virile knight. He wore tight hose that had to be custom stretched. He held tournaments he no longer participated in. He thundered about chivalry while wheezing through breath that smelled of pheasant and beer. But beneath the velvet and steel was a man crumbling under his own weight, physically and metaphorically. He had become too large for his kingdom, too furious for peace, and too heavy for even his own horse. And yet, his genetic legacy couldn't hold weight either, because the next queen lost 17 children, and history never let her forget. Queen Anne was pregnant 17 times, but none of her children survived to adulthood. Queen Anne's legacy is written in ink, but her grief is etched in silent 17 pregnancies, 17 losses, miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died in days, toddlers who withered away. One child, Prince William, survived into childhood, giving the court fleeting hope, only to die at age 11. After that, nothing. Anne's reign should have been a celebration of dynastic stability. Instead, it became a tragic echo chamber of nurseries left empty and tiny coffins carried out in the night. Doctors poked and theorized, bad blood, poor diet, congenital issues, but no one could explain why the womb of the queen turned into a cradle of death. Her body bore the toll. Swollen with gout, dependent on constant medical attention, often transported by sedan chair because walking was too painful. Her spirit bore it too. Those close to her described periods of deep depression and sudden outbursts. A monarch grieving alone, over and over, while the kingdom whispered about curses and divine punishment. And yet, through all this, she ruled, stubbornly, softly, with pain stitched into every royal decision. But while Anne suffered quiet tragedy, the next king lived a secret life of illegal love marrying not for power, but in defiance of his own crown. George IV had a secret second marriage, which was illegal, to a Catholic woman. George IV wasn't known for restraint. He gambled, drank, and seduced like a man trying to speedrun royal scandal. But his most dangerous move came wrapped in lace and whispered vows in illegal marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic. Under British law, especially the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, no monarch could marry without the king's consent, and no heir could legally wed a Catholic. George knew both. He didn't care. In 1785, he married her in secret, convinced he could keep the crown and the woman he loved. The ceremony was private, the paperwork hidden. But it happened. She wore the ring. He called her his wife. For years, he publicly denied it, while privately writing her love letters signed, "Your husband." It became a scandalous mystery, whispered in salons and debated in Parliament. When he later married Caroline of Brunswick, legally he did so bitterly and possibly still devoted to Maria. Even after their romantic bond faded, he ordered that she never be publicly insulted. When he died, a miniature portrait of Maria was found around his neck. Not Caroline, not state symbols, just the ghost of an illegal love. And while George's heart defied the law, the next king's passion ticked and chimed because he was in love with the sound of clocks. Edward VI loved clocks and kept dozens in his private chambers. Edward VI was a boy king with the weight of a fracturing kingdom on his narrow shoulders, but inside his chambers, away from the Reformation's chaos and the whispering of scheming advisors, found calm in machinery. Not swords, not toys, clocks. He adored them, collected them, studied them. Mechanical timepieces lined his walls like loyal sentinels. Each one ticked and talked a little differently, forming a chorus of movement and order. Some played music. Others featured miniature automatatini knights jousting at the stroke of 12. It wasn't just a passing interest. Edward kept logs, adjusted settings, and even learned rudimentary clock maintenance. He was fascinated by their precision, their predictability, perhaps because his world was anything but. As a monarch surrounded by unpredictable adults, ticking gears offered control. Servants said he'd sit for hours watching the pendulum swing, lips moving silently as he counted. In a world spinning with political anxiety, clocks were his comfort, his rhythm, his anchor. But for all his love of structure, Edward would die at 15, his internal clock silenced too soon. Still, his obsession lived on. And the Queen who followed? She didn't keep time. She celebrated death sometimes with yellow dresses and public displays of morbid cheer. That was fact 33, and somehow we've already met a mole-blessing king, a queen with a kill list, and a royal so drunk he had to be sewn into his pants. If you're loving the chaos, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more royal absurdity to come. And just for fun, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you binging British madness at breakfast or winding down with monarchical mayhem at midnight? We're dying to know who's out there in the kingdom of YouTube. Elizabeth I made her ladies wear yellow when her enemy died to celebrate. In the Tudor court, color was never just fashion, it was warfare stitched in silk. And Queen Elizabeth I, master of political theater, used color like a sword. When Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, her prisoner was finally executed in 1587 after years of political cat and mouse, Elizabeth made a theatrical decree. Her ladies would wear yellow. Not black for mourning, not white for purity, yellow for joy. Some say it was a twisted celebration, a monarch reveling in victory under the disguise of court ritual. Others claim it was Elizabeth's way of publicly mourning a fellow sovereign, while privately rejoicing that a threat to her crown had been neatly removed from the chessboard. Either way, it sent a message. Loud, garish, unmissable. Yellow swept through the palace like wildfire. Gowns shimmered in the sunlight. Courtiers bowed with forced smiles. It was regal, gloating, masquerading as courtly dignity. The Virgin Queen had claimed her greatest rival's head, and she did so without shedding a visible tear. But while Elizabeth painted victory in gold, the next monarch was obsessed not with death, but with demonstrating his own guidebook on how to hunt them. James I loved witches, but only if they were in his book. He personally wrote a witch-hunting manual. Long before Salem burned with paranoia, King James I of England lit the match. Fascinated no, consumed be the occult. James wasn't just a believer in witchcraft, he was its literary authority. In 1597, he penned Demonology, a royal manifesto on spotting witches, interrogating them, and most importantly, eliminating them. It wasn't casual interest. James saw witchcraft as a direct threat to divine monarchy. He blamed storms on witches, failures of state, witchcraft. Even a near shipwreck he once experienced became evidence of a supernatural plot. So he took action. Under his reign, trials increased, torture methods were refined, and suspicion bloomed across the countryside. Women, often poor, old, or inconvenient, were dragged from their homes and condemned based on hearsay, livestock misbehavior, or malformed birthmarks. Yet, despite the fear and fire, James styled himself as a man of learning. He didn't claim superstition, he claimed scholarship. His book became required reading for witch hunters and helped shape the legal framework for persecution across Britain. He lit the fire and called it enlightenment. But while James dictated how witches should look, the next king dictated how he should look, no matter how vain or how many portraits it took. Richard II was so vain. He ordered that all his portraits show him with flawless skin. Richard II believed in divine kingship, not just in principle but in face. His royal image was sacred, and he guarded it like a relic. Every painting, every fresco, every illuminated manuscript had to portray him not as he was, but as he wanted to be. Ethereal, unblemished, flawless, no wrinkles, no spots, no human error. He wasn't merely curating an image, he was manufacturing mythology. Artisans received direct orders. Smooth the skin, elongate the features, add a holy glow. Painters who strayed too close to realism found their commissions quietly revoked or dramatically destroyed. Even as his political power crumbled, his painted power endured. In an era where most monarchs were remembered by their deeds, Richard wanted to be remembered by his jawline. His actual reign was riddled with failure rebellions, lavish spending, tyrannical decisions. But his portraits, they sang with sanctity. It was cosmetic control taken to royal extremes. A face not just meant to inspire faith, but demand it. Not a king, but an icon. And while Richard sculpted his image in pigment and fantasy, the next monarch scribbled far less noble thoughts in the margins of government papers, no less. His passion? Fart jokes. George III collected fart jokes and wrote them down in the margins of official papers. George III is often remembered for his mental instability, his losing the American colonies, and his babbling conversations with livestock. But what often goes overlooked is one of his less regal hobbies, a deep and enduring appreciation for fart humor. Yes, the King of Great Britain, who dressed in powdered wigs and spoke of divine monarchy, loved a good flatulence joke. And not just in private, he scribbled them in the margins of royal documents. Foreign policy memos, agricultural reports, taxation papers. If a minister's draft left a little white space, George III filled it with scrawled puns, witticisms, and toots of literary gas. Pass wind, not war, he once allegedly scrawled next to a treaty discussion. Some jokes were Shakespearean in their complexity, others just drawings of butts and motion lines. It was the coping mechanism of a king spiraling into chaos. His mind, slipping from lucidity, found strange relief in bodily humor. A royal mind unraveling still, reaching for laughter, even if it came from the gut. And while George laughed alone in ink and paper, the next monarch would demand a more literal companionship, even in death bringing his beloved dog into the tomb with him. Edward VII was buried with his dog Caesar, which got more flowers than some diplomats. Edward VII lived like a decadent lion's, waggering through life with mistresses, cigars, and scandal. But when death finally came for him in 1910, he didn't go alone. Lying beside him, in ceremony and memorial, was his most loyal companion, a small white wire fox terrier named Caesar. This wasn't symbolic. Caesar marched in the king's funeral procession, placed directly behind the casket before princes, generals, and heads of state. The dog wore a black mourning ribbon around his neck and walked with solemn dignity. Onlookers wept, newspapers swooned, diplomats grumbled from their back row placements. But Caesar's presence didn't end at the parade. When Edward was buried, Caesar received more floral tributes than half the crowned heads in attendance. He was immortalized in sculpture, forever perched at the foot of the king's tomb in Windsor. Visitors often forget the names of the dignitaries in attendance, but everyone remembers the dog. It was loyalty that transcended bloodlines and royal politics. In a world of arranged marriages and formal alliances, Caesar was chosen, loved, buried with the man who ruled nations. But while Edward was memorialized in stone, another monarch's body would be dug up centuries later, becoming a grotesque curiosity for passing tourists. Charles I, embalmed body was reportedly dug up and admired by tourists centuries later. Charles I died as a martyr, a traitor depending on your politics. Beheaded in 1649 after a civil war that turned England against itself, he was buried quietly in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. His funeral was muted, his memory divisive. But what the executioner's blade started, centuries of curiosity finished. In the early 1800s, During chapel renovations, workers stumbled upon a sealed coffin. Inside was a body, head sewn roughly back onto the torso, still dressed in decayed finery. It was Charles, perfectly embalmed, eerily preserved. The workers didn't quietly reseal the coffin. Instead, they brought in spectators. Politicians, royals, even tourists were allowed to view the body. One observer noted the blackened skin and still visible beard. Another took note of the stitched neck and the royal insignia on the garments. It became a macabre attraction, an executed king, transformed into a wax doll for the morbidly curious. Eventually, Charles was reburied with more reverence, but for a time, the sanctity of his death was replaced by awkward stares and historical rubbernecking. And while Charles's legacy was exhumed with awe, the next queen's vanity would be buried under 3,000 dresses, most of which she barely wore. Queen Elizabeth I allegedly had 3,000 dresses, though she wore the same few on repeat. Queen Elizabeth I didn't just dress like a monarch, she dressed like an icon, a living painting, a theatrical construct so immaculate it bordered on divine. Her wardrobe was infamous. According to court records and later estimates, she owned upwards of 3,000 gowns. Silks from the East, velvets from Italy, pearls sewn in constellations, embroidery that could have bankrupted a duke. It was fashion as propaganda, draped in gold thread. But here's the twist. Despite this textile empire, Elizabeth was known to wear the same few dresses on repeat. Not because she lacked options, but because she understood the power of a signature look. The gowns she chose became part of her, myth-recognizable, daunting, unchanging. The rest? They stayed in wardrobes, gathering dust like forgotten soldiers in her arsenal of majesty. Some believe she reused favorite garments to control her image. Others suggest it was superstition or comfort, or a subtle snub to courtiers trying to read her mood by fabric choice. Either way, her closets bulged with ghost dresses, worn not for function, but for power. And speaking of power plays, the next monarch didn't just perform for court danced, forcing his audience to watch every jiggling royal step. Henry VIII made up dances and forced his court to watch him perform them. Before Henry VIII ballooned into a gluttonous tyrant hoisted by cranes, he was spry, vain, and theatrical. And nothing captured that earlier Henry better than his self-choreographed dances, royal jigs of ego and enthusiasm. These weren't formal court dances or stately pavans. These were personal performances, created by Henry. For Henry. He'd gather the court, command silence, and burst into elaborate routines that blended martial swagger with bizarre flourishes. Think leaping spins, flourishes with swords. At times, a lute solo as his entrance theme. No one dared laugh. Laughter was treason, adjacent. Courtiers clapped on cue, even as they quietly suffered second-hand embarrassment. Imagine a man who'd executed 2 wives, now prancing around like a Renaissance TikTok star, breathless, beet red, demanding applause. It wasn't just vanity. It was domination. Forcing nobles to watch him flail was a reminder. He didn't need approval. He was approval. And while Henry danced himself into delusion, the next queen traveled with something even more surreal than a retinue-owned talking pocket parrot, whose commentary was as colorful as its feathers. Mary I kept a live parrot in her pocket, which she called Little Thomas. Mary I wasn't known for her sense of whimsy. She burned Protestants, ruled with iron faith, and left behind a reputation drenched in fear. But tucked inside that fearsome facet literally was a surprising sidekick, a pocket-sized parrot named Little Thomas. This wasn't a decorative accessory. Little Thomas lived in the folds of Mary's gowns, chirping commentary and occasionally mimicking human voices. Courtiers were stunned. Here was a queen capable of signing death warrants in the morning and giggling at her birds' mispronunciations by lunch. Mary doted on him, fed him from her hand, consulted him, some whispered, during moments of stress. Whether she truly believed the bird was more than just a Peter if she used him to unnerve the court is still debated, but one thing's certain. Little Thomas became a fixture in her chambers. When Mary entered, he was there, nestled near her heart, staring with tiny glassy eyes at the uneasy guests. The irony wasn't lost on the court. England's most feared queen carried joy in her pocket, while fire and judgment trailed in her footsteps. But the next king had his own way of asserting royal dominance by dining under the cold stares of knights in full armor, even when he was completely alone. Richard III had his dinner served by knights in armor, even when eating alone. Richard III didn't just wear the crown, he armored his ego in steel. At his court, meals weren't quiet affairs or chances for reflection. They were staged dramas, and the starring roles were played by knights in full metal regalia, not just during banquets, not for guests. Even when Richard dined alone, clanking knights stood guard, polished and rigid, like sculptures come to life. Why? Perhaps it was to project power, even to himself. Perhaps he feared assassination. Or maybe, just maybe, he liked the sound of it, the rhythm of armored boots echoing through stone halls as he tore into roast venison. Every bite was a declaration. I am watched. I am protected. I am not alone. But it was also a strange show of insecurity. A ruler terrified of his own reflection in the court. A king who knew enemies crept not just at borders, but in whispers and banquet halls. The armor wasn't just on his men, it was psychological. And while Richard dined in paranoid glory, the next king met his end in the most awkwardly physical way possible, exploding like a grotesque piñata after falling from a horse. William the Conqueror died when his horse tripped, bursting his enormous belly. William the Conqueror earned his place in history by changing it. He defeated Harold at Hastings, took the English throne, and reshaped the realm with fire and sword. But his death? That came not in battle, but in pure, humiliating slapstick. Near the end of his life, William had grown fat, not royally plump enormous. His stomach was a swollen orb of indulgence. While riding through Montez, laying siege to yet another rebellious city, his horse stumbled on burning debris. William was thrown violently forward onto the saddle pommel. The result? His overstuffed gut ruptured. That's right. The man who conquered England died because his belly burst. He lingered in agony for weeks, oozing infection, while his empire buzzed in anxiety. And the final indignity? His corpse was so bloated that it wouldn't fit in the stone sarcophagus at his funeral. When monks tried to force the lid closed, the pressure caused his body to burst again, filling the church with an unbearable stench. Mourners fled. From conqueror to carcass, he left behind not just a legacy, but a reminder. Even emperors can end up as bloated punchlines. But while William's body exploded, the next queen guarded her meals with paranoia so intense, she required a personal food taster into her old age. Queen Victoria had a personal food taster, even in old age. By the time Queen Victoria was a shrunken widow draped in eternal black, her empire was massive, but her appetite was small and suspicious. Despite her age and diminishing public presence, she remained convinced that someone, somewhere, might try to poison her. So she kept a personal food taster, always. Every meal, every soup, cutlet, or biscuit was sampled in advance. A loyal servant took the first bite, paused, and waited. No reaction? Then Her Majesty would dine. It became ritual. Not a precaution, but a performance of imperial paranoia. After all, who would dare poison the grandmother of Europe? Apparently, Victoria believed the answer was anyone. She trusted no foreign kitchen, no freshly prepared dish. Even palace chefs were monitored like suspects. Her food taster became as vital as her advisors, because what good was ruling the world if you couldn't trust your own teacup? And as her body aged, her caution only grew. Meals slowed. Servants watched with silent reverence. It wasn't just a meal, it was a royal security drill. But while Victoria eyed her plate with suspicion, the next king turned his nose at fish in public, yet pretended to love it, all for the sake of diplomacy. Edward VIII couldn't stand eating fish, but pretended to love it for diplomatic dinners. Edward VIII was a man of contradiction, fashionable yet reckless, royal yet rebellious. But one of his most bizarre contradictions sat quietly on his dinner plate. Fish. He hated it. Despised the smell, loathed the texture, gagged at the taste. And yet, in the gilded halls of diplomatic banquets and foreign receptions, Edward would force down forkfuls of trout, sole, or salmon, with a courtly smile that masked his inner revulsion. To snub a dish was to snub a host, and Edward, despite his disdain for royal protocol, understood the optics of diplomacy. He didn't flinch at political upheaval, but he grimaced through caviar. Staff were sworn to secrecy. Dinners became charades of tolerance, with Edward sipping water between chews to keep from retching. Some claimed he developed subtle tricks, hiding bites under bread, shifting food to another guest's plate during distractions, or praising the wine mid-mouthful to avoid swallowing. But never did he admit the truth at the table. The King of England preferred honesty in scandal, but not at supper. And while Edward faked culinary pleasure, the next king's hairpiece collection was no less theatrical, especially when he bragged about strands that allegedly came from unicorns. George IV had a collection of wigs, some made from unicorn hair, or so he claimed. George IV was not content to merely be royal. He wanted to look supernaturally royal. With a stomach that sagged and a face bloated from brandy, he turned to illusion to maintain the facade of youthful grandeur. Chief among his tools, wigs. Not one, not two, but an entire closet's worth. Powdered, curled, perfumed. And among them, a few he claimed were made from unicorn hair. Yes, unicorns. That's what he told guests, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with the deadpan authority of a man who considered lying a form of art. The wigs shimmered strangely in candlelight. They were lighter than the rest, whiter than ivory. Whether they were made from albino horsehair or simply high-quality imports from exotic animals, George spun the tale like a fairy godmother with a gambling problem. Courtiers nodded. Guests blinked. No one questioned the claim. He was the king, after all. If George IV said a mythical beast died for his hairstyle, then so be it. He wore them like crowns. He changed them to match moods, each one an extension of his fantasy self, more legend than man. But while George wore wigs with animalistic flair, the next king targeted beards, banning them in court, only to grow one himself in the mud of war. Henry V banned beards in court, but grew one himself on campaign. Henry V was a king of discipline, ruthless, austere, and intensely focused. In his court, order reigned supreme, and appearances mattered as much as loyalty. One of his earliest decrees? No beards. Clean faces only. Smooth jaws. His court would reflect his vision, unified, sharp, and uncompromising. So when Henry paraded through the royal halls, every nobleman followed suit razors replacing razzmatazz, barber appointments becoming political necessities. A single whisker out of place could suggest defiance. No stubble, no softness, just skin. But then came war. As Henry crossed the Channel to wage his brutal campaign in France, the polished veneer gave way to grit. The king caked in mud, armored and blooded let his beard grow. It was more than neglect. It was strategy. Among his troops, it was a symbol of endurance, a badge of campaign masculinity. The beard that was forbidden in court became holy in the trenches. Soldiers cheered it. Artists romanticized it. His battlefield beard became legend ironic, fierce, and entirely unshaven. He returned home not just a conqueror of Agincourt, but a walking contradiction, the man who outlawed beards, now lionized by one. And while Henry's beard roared with glory, the next king's hygiene habits left noses twitching, for he saw bathing as an act of ruin. James I hated bathing, claiming it washed away natural oils. James I, Stuart King of England, united two crowns and divided quite a few noses. While he loved intellectual pursuits and wrote obsessively about witchcraft and politics, personal hygiene was a battlefield he simply refused to fight. He hated bathing, not feared-loathed. Water, to James, was not the essence of cleanliness but a solvent of health. He claimed it stripped the body of its natural oils, which he believed served as a divine barrier against illness. So he didn't wash. Not regularly, not thoroughly. His courtiers grew accustomed to the smell of their sovereign, which was described as earthy on kind days and concerning on others. Clothes were perfumed to mask the lack of skin contact with soap. And as for servants, they worked around the issue, dabbing damp cloths near his neck, brushing flakes from royal sleeves with forced smiles. James believed dirt was medicinal, that his body, in its royal funk, was balanced by nature. And so he marinated in it, writing essays, receiving ambassadors and founding dynasties, while bacteria celebrated unseen coronations across his scalp. But while James marinated in natural protection, the next queen bore a secret of her own, a digit too many for court comfort. Anne Boleyn had a sixth finger, which courtiers whispered about, but were too scared to mention. Anne Boleyn walked into history as a queen, a scandal, and ultimately a decapitated icon. But among the many rumors swirling around her rise to power, one detail whispered through the Tudor halls like a curse. She had 6 fingers. A tiny, extra digit on her right hand, more bump than finger, more taboo than deformity. Was it true? Contemporary accounts vary. But in the paranoid, gossip-fed ecosystem of Henry VIII's court, it didn't matter. Enemies of Anne didn't need facts, just fuel. They said it was proof she was a witch, that the devil had marked her. Some swore it twitched during Mass. Others claimed it gave her unnatural power over the king. But no one dared say a word to her face. She was the queen. The king's obsession. The woman who split a church in half. Even if she had a tail and breathed fire, her courtiers would have smiled and curtsied. Later, after her fall, the story grew sharper, like her accusers needed the 6th finger to justify what they'd done, to make her less human, less tragic. And while Anne was scrutinized for fingers, the next queen painted her face with crushed beetles and coal, crafting beauty from death itself. Elizabeth I used crushed beetles as lip color and coal dust as eyeliner. To sit on the English throne in the 16th century was to perform a constant illusion. For Elizabeth I, that illusion was layered in white lead, beetle shells, and soot. Her face, immortalized in portraits and poetry, wasn't a reflection of nature, but an alchemical mask applied with sacred precision. For her signature red lips, Elizabeth used cochineal, a vivid dye harvested by crushing insects into crimson powder. It was rare, expensive, and disturbingly effective. She painted it on thick, because the more vibrant the lip, the more untouchable the queen. Her eyes, rimmed in coal dust, a dark shadow that added contrast and mystique, but also edged toward toxic territory. Her entire makeup routine was a slow death sentence in pursuit of immortality. The white base ate her skin, the beetles added fire, the coal rimmed her gaze like a funeral veil, but the result? A monarch who glowed like a ghost and radiated like a deity. No one saw her true face. That was the point. Even as her skin blistered beneath the layers, she became more legend than flesh. And while Elizabeth wielded brushes like a painter of myth, the next king found his joy not in mirrors but in digging ditches with his bare royal hands. Edward II loved digging ditches by hand, even in royal gardens. Most monarchs order fountains to be installed. Edward II, he dug the trenches himself, with a spade, by hand. In royal gardens, royal boots caked in mud, his crown metaphorically tossed into the dirt. At first, the court thought it a passing whimsome rustic diversion to show humility or charm. But Edward kept doing it, not as performance, but obsession. He'd sneak away from councils to grab a shovel. He'd toil under the sun, sleeves rolled, sometimes shirtless, sometimes muttering. Servants were horrified. Nobles were confused. A king acting like a peasant? Blasphemy. But Edward didn't care. Manual labor, for him, was therapy. In a world of deceit and ceremony, the earth was honest. The shovel was loyal. The ditches weren't symbolic. They were real. Trenches, holes, furrows for irrigation, or nothing at all. One courtier reportedly asked what he was building. Edward just smiled and kept digging. It wasn't the first sign of his eccentricity or his disconnect from courtly expectation. His reign would end badly, brutally. But for a time, he ruled with soil under his nails. And while Edward found solace in dirt, the next king found vengeance in silence, locking his own wife away, never speaking of her again. George I locked his wife in a German castle for adultery and never spoke of her again. Long before George I became king of Great Britain, he was a scorned husband. His wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, was accused of having an affair with a Swedish count. Not just whisper-sletters, rumors, perhaps even a plan to elope. George didn't rage. He didn't duel. He acted with the cold brutality of a man who preferred silence over scandal. He had her locked away in Alden House, a remote German castle, in 1694. She remained there for the rest of her life, 32 years. Not a prison, officially, but a gilded tomb. She received no visitors. She never saw her children again. And George? He never uttered her name in public again, never acknowledged her existence. As far as he was concerned, she had ceased to be. She died in isolation, long after George had ascended to the English throne. He did not attend the funeral. He offered no statement. Their marriage was buried not in earth, but in silence. It was a royal vanishing act tone that spoke volumes about power, pride, and punishment. And while George erased his queen, the next Mary tried to erase a nose, demanding her husband's portrait be reworked for looking too Spanish. Queen Mary I had her husband's portrait redone because she thought his nose was too Spanish. When Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain, it was supposed to be a union of Dynasty Asa, fusion of Catholic might. But the reality was more complicated, especially when the Queen caught sight of her new husband's official portrait. Her verdict? Not regal enough. Specifically, the nose. Too long, too Spanish. In an era when political portraits were weapons of statecraft, a slightly off nose could suggest foreignness, weakness, or unwanted dominance. Mary, ever image-conscious, was having none of it. She ordered the painting redone. More noble, more English, more symmetrical. It wasn't about aesthetics alone, it was a microcosm of her court's unease with the Spanish alliance. People muttered about foreign influence, about England becoming a satellite of Spain. The nose became a symbol. And Mary, shrewd as ever, wanted her husband's face to reflect her throne, not his ancestry. The revised version showed Philip with a softened, idealized face. It was politics painted in oil. A new nose, a new narrative. But while Mary reworked faces to fit power, the next king filled his palace with shrieking chaos courtesy of his favorite royal roommates. Monkeys. Henry VIII kept monkeys and let them roam the palace. Henry VIII had a court that feared his moods, his appetites, and his ever-shifting marital status, but among the silk and solemnity roamed a pack of unexpected companions. Monkeys. Yes, actual monkeys. Not chained in cages, not kept in royal menageries like curiosities. These were free-roaming mischief-makers, allowed to scamper through the gilded halls of his palaces. They tugged at tablecloths during dinners. They stole ribbons from courtiers. They chased diplomats with shrieks and teeth. To Henry, this wasn't chaos, it was comedy. His laughter at their antics was the kind that made others join in nervously, unsure if it was amusement or madness. After all, this was a king who beheaded wives like bad habits. If a monkey stole your wig, you laughed unless you liked your head attached. The monkeys became symbols of unpredictability, not just pets but reflections of their master's temperament. Playful, disruptive, dangerous. No one dared suggest they be removed. They were part of the furniture, now leaping metaphors for a reign where nothing, not even the royal menagerie, stayed caged for long. And while Henry let chaos swing from the rafters, his great-great-granddaughter turned to the dead-holding seances to whisper to a ghost no one dared mock. Queen Victoria believed in seances and held them secretly after Albert died. Queen Victoria, the grand matriarch of the empire, the symbol of restraint, dignity, and endless mourning, spent her nights trying to talk to ghosts. After Prince Albert's death, her grief crystallized into ritual, and beyond mourning dress, beyond the daily conversations with his portrait, she ventured into something even more intimate, spiritualism. Behind closed palace doors, she held seances. Candles were lit, tables cleared, mediums brought in under cover of night. These were not fringe affairs conducted in drawing rooms of desperate widows, they were royal appointments, and the guest of honor was always the same, Albert. She wanted messages, signs, confirmation that his presence lingered beyond the veil. Some nights she claimed to hear his voice through mediums. Other times, she wept in silence, waiting for anything to happen. Her court tried to downplay it. The press didn't know. But inside the palace, it was well understood. The Queen of the British Empire was consulting the dead. These seances became less about answers and more about preservation, a love too big for life, seeking echoes in death. And while Victoria whispered into shadows, the next king showed dominance in the most literal way by devouring lions, one bite at a time. Richard the Lionheart ate lion meat at feasts to show dominance. Richard I. Lionheart, crusader, icon, wasn't just a warrior king. He was a man who lived by myth and made sure everyone else did too. On campaign, his dinners weren't just sustenance. They were theater, and sometimes they featured the ultimate flex, lion meat, roasted, seasoned, served like a challenge to every other predator in the room. To eat lion was more than Derringit was symbolic. It was Richard declaring himself the King of Kings. not just by title but by diet. You are what you eat, after all. And Richard? He wanted his enemies to know that even the fiercest beast of nature ended up on his plate. No one at court dared refuse a bite if offered. Diplomats grimaced and chewed. Soldiers whispered stories of the day their king carved through a lion's steak like it was mutton. Whether it was true or inflated legend hardly mattered. The image stuck. And that image, that fusion of man and myth was everything to Richard. In the Holy Land or in France, he wasn't just leading armies, he was curating legend. But while Richard digested beasts, the next queen may have worn honey on her head. A scalp claimed, perhaps, from a very royal corpse. Elizabeth I wore a wig made from her executed cousin's hair. According to legend, Elizabeth I was no stranger to symbolic fashion. Every ruff, jewel, and embroidered phoenix told a story. But none of her alleged adornments carried a tale as grima, as unsettling as the wig she was rumored to wear, made from the hair of her executed cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. According to whispered legend, after Mary was beheaded for treason in 1587, her hair-thick, red, unmistakably royal was harvested by someone in the execution chamber. Instead of burning or burying it with the body, it was supposedly preserved, styled, and turned into a wig, a trophy, a warning, a crown of conquest. Elizabeth was already known for wearing elaborate wigs to mask her thinning hair and age. But this particular one, if it existed, wasn't about vanity. It was power incarnate. Imagine attending court, looking into the eyes of the Virgin Queen and seeing her cousin's hair fluttering on her scalp. Every nod would be a victory, every breeze a ghost. No records confirm the wig's existence outright. But the story stuck, because it felt like Elizabeth cold, brilliant, theatrical. And while she may have worn the dead, the next king preferred his audience feathered and chirping, holding conversations not with ministers, but with birds. George III talked to birds during his mental breakdowns. George III, the monarch who lost America, was also the king who lost touch with reality. As his mind unraveled, so did the boundaries of royal decorum. One of the most haunting signs of his decline, he began talking to birds. Not metaphorically, literally. In the lush gardens of Kew or pacing through the royal halls, George would stop to address pigeons, sparrows, crows. He spoke to them like courtiers, sometimes in English, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in gibberish. He asked them for advice. He thanked them for their loyalty. Once, he reportedly gave a full speech to a robin perched on a windowsill, commending it for its graceful silence and patience. It was heartbreaking, yes, but also surreal. A monarch draped in velvet, speaking with the earnestness of a statesman to animals that chirped, tilted their heads, and flew away mid-conversation. The royal family and doctors did what they could, which was mostly to hide it, but rumors leaked. George's mind was slipping, one bird monologue at a time. And while George's court grew quieter, the next queen's chambers were anything but filled with the clinking of glasses and the sound of royal ladies passing out in their corsets. Queen Anne played drinking games with her ladies, often passing out in her chair. Queen Anne ruled a kingdom, but her court ran on claret and cider. Beneath the powdered wigs and tight-laced bodices, her private chambers pulsed with the chaos of drinking games more fitting for a pirate ship than a palace. Her Majesty, prone to melancholy and swollen with chronic illness, found comfort and escapism the bottom of a goblet. She didn't drink alone. Her ladies-in-waiting were roped in, willingly or not. Cards were dealt, dice rolled, toasts made, and before long, The queen herself was known to slur her speech, hiccup through policy talk, and on more than one occasion fall asleep mid-court session, snoring softly in her heavily cushioned throne. These were not discreet affairs. Ministers were forced to navigate royal decisions while tiptoeing around hungover courtiers. Foreign envoys tried to decode whether the queen's flushed face was from rage or red wine. And Anne? She kept sipping. Some said it was her way of coping with loss. Others, a rebellion against the rigid expectations of queenship. But one thing was certain under Queen Anne: diplomacy sometimes came with a hangover. And if her court was soaked in spirits, the next king's throne room came with rubber ducks named, of course, for royal amusement. Edward VII once fell asleep during his own coronation rehearsal. Edward VII, king of indulgence and endless patience for opulence, had waited nearly 60 years to wear the crown, but when the time finally came, he couldn't even stay awake for it. During one of his elaborate coronation rehearsals meticulously staged with endless rituals, bows, and incantations, Edward simply nodded off. The chapel was hushed. Robes rustled, incense floated gently, and the king, overwhelmed by the sheer pomp of his own ascendancy, began to snore, not a polite doze or dignified head dip. Witnesses said he slumped in his ornate chair mid-blessing, eyes closed, mouth open. The archbishop, trying to preserve dignity, continued the rehearsal without pausing. Courtiers exchanged looks, but said nothing. No one wanted to be the first to poke the monarch awake. To be fair, Edward was not in the best health. His coronation had already been delayed by a sudden bout of appendicitis, but falling asleep at the most sacred rehearsal of royal ceremony? That took a particular brand of regal detachment. And while Edward snoozed through history, the next king redefined throne room in the most literal way by decorating bathrooms with portraits of himself and calling them his personal gallery. James II had portraits of himself hung in every bathroom, calling them his thrones. If James II believed in anything, it was divine right and decorative consistency. His image as stoic, regal, thick with authority was not just for state halls and palace galleries. No, James wanted to oversee everything, including his subjects' most private moments. So he had his own portraits installed in every royal bathroom and referred to them with a straight face as his thrones. There he sat in the walls watching silently from above the chamber pots and commodes. Not just one painting either, multiple, in different styles, some gilded, some modest, all featuring his face, gazing down like a disapproving god of plumbing. It wasn't a joke. James sincerely believed that royal presence should never be absent, not even in lavatories. To him, it was a symbolic reminder that the monarch ruled all spaces, even the ones where dignity took a momentary leave. Courtiers were horrified. Guests didn't know where to look. Servants reported avoiding eye contact with the walls. It was absurd, yes, but it was also brilliant propaganda, a message that the king was everywhere. And while James watched from above, the next monarch turned his back on dignity entirely, crowning his monkey as king of mischief, complete with a tiny crown. Charles II had a pet monkey that wore a crown. Charles II, the merry monarch, never let things like decorum or tradition get in the way of a good time. His court was a festival of charm, wine, and increasingly strange pets. But his favorite? A monkey. A small, chaotic creature that reportedly wore a crown because of course it did. The monkey didn't just live in the palace, it reigned. It sat beside Charles during audiences, snatched fruit from noblemen's plates, and once tore the wig off a visiting ambassador. Rather than punish it, Charles roared with laughter and toasted its honest mischief. He reportedly had a tiny crown made bejeweled and ridiculous and placed it on the monkey's head during court banquets. Some thought it was satire, others subtle mockery of the monarchy itself. Charles, a survivor of exile and civil war, knew the absurdity of royal life. Perhaps the crowned monkey was his way of winking at the system, a reminder that power and pageantry often came down to performance. Whatever the reason, the court learned to bow, if not in reverence, then at least in fear of their wigs being stolen. And while Charles crowned his pet, the next king would strum his lute in the worst possible way, forcing everyone to suffer through every out-of-tune note. Henry VIII played the lute, badly but no one dared tell him. Among Henry VIII's many larger-than-life traits, gluttony, wrath, marital turnover, his musical passion was perhaps the most persistent. He fancied himself a Renaissance man, poet, athlete, scholar, and of course, musician. The lute was his chosen instrument, and he played it often, loudly, enthusiastically, badly. To the royal ear, each pluck was divine. To everyone else, a cacophony of missed notes and rhythmic confusion. But no one said a word. Who would? This was a man who beheaded wives, dissolved monasteries, and invented entire churches to suit his moods. If Henry wanted to believe he was a musical genius, the court would nod along in perfect tempo. Servants tiptoed through his private music rooms. Courtiers clapped with feverish politeness after every disjointed performance. The king would pause, chest-heaving, flushed with joy, awaiting praise that came not from honesty, but survival instinct. He even composed songs, some of which are preserved, but whether those were actually his work or the product of terrified scribes is anyone's guess. And while Henry's fingers mangled melodies, the next queen's hands struck with more force, because when courtiers displeased her, she didn't write letters, she slapped faces. Elizabeth I sometimes slapped her courtiers in the face when displeased. Elizabeth I ruled like a seasoned general, calculating, controlled, and fiercely self-aware. But even the Virgin Queen had her limits, and when those were crossed, diplomacy gave way to something far more direct. She slapped people, not symbolically, physically, across the face. This wasn't an everyday event, but it wasn't myth either. Several court accounts confirm that when Elizabeth was displeased, particularly with male courtiers who pushed her patience, reached for her royal palm. A sharp retort followed by a sharper smack. Gloves off, ring on. The sound echoed through velvet halls. Why slap? Because she could. It was a display of dominance that shattered the illusion of untouchable male advisors. It reminded everyone in her orbit that while she might not have a crown of testosterone, she had absolute control. Courtiers didn't protest. They bowed, apologized. Some even begged for the chance to redeem themselves before the sting faded, because being slapped by the queen meant you were still useful, still within the blast radius of her attention. But when her half-sister reigned before her, the punishments were far more permanent, because Mary didn't slap her enemies. She burned them. Mary I burned 280 Protestants, then reportedly asked if it was enough. Mary I didn't earn the nickname Bloody Mary by accident. In her 5-year reign, she sent 280 Protestants to the flames in her attempt to restore Catholicism to England. Public executions, human bonfires, martyrs turned to ash in town squares while crowds choked on the smoke of religious cleansing. But what chilled even her own advisors wasn't the policy, it was the cold arithmetic of it all. She kept count, and after one particularly large execution in Oxford, she reportedly turned to her council and asked, "Is it enough?" Not, "Was justice done?" Not, "Have the heretics repented?" Just enough. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was religious fervor. Mary truly believed she was saving souls by incinerating their bodies, but her inability to see the horror behind the numbers sealed her legacy. England watched the flames rise and turned cold. When she died, few mourned. Her funeral was short, her impact scorched into history like the pyres she lit. And while Mary's hands were stained in fire, the next queen would cradle the dead not in sorrow, but with eerie intimacy, dressing her favorite corpse in black and keeping it close forever. Queen Victoria was buried with Albert's dressing gown and a mold of his hand. Grief ruled Queen Victoria longer than any prime minister. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she didn't just mourn, she transformed mourning into monarchy. Black became her permanent wardrobe. Her smile disappeared from public view. And when she finally died in 1901, she took her sorrow with her literally. In her coffin, alongside royal insignia and state honors, were two deeply personal objects, Albert's old dressing gown and a plaster mold of his hand, a fraying garment and a cold replica symbols of a love she refused to let go, even in death. This wasn't sentimental pageantry, it was ritual obsession. Every night she had touched that mold, held it, spoke to it, and now she would hold it forever. She also requested locks of Albert's hair be buried with her, along with photographs and other tokens. The queen who ruled the largest empire on earth chose to be remembered not by her crown, but by her loss. And while Victoria's coffin was a shrine to devotion, the next king expressed his grief in far less edible fashion by chucking an entire roast out a window when it dared displease him. George IV once threw an entire roast out the window, declaring it too dry. George IV didn't believe in subtlety. When he loved something, it was smothered in praise. When he hated it, well, windows opened. One evening, during a lavish banquet at Carlton House, a roast was served to the king. Golden brown, aromatic, the envy of every hungry guest. George carved it, tasted it, and immediately stood up. Too dry. He snapped and hurled the entire roast out the window. It wasn't hyperbole. Witnesses watched in horror as the meat arced through the night air and landed somewhere in the garden with an undignified thud. Silence followed, then nervous laughter. And finally, the scramble to replace the dish with something more palatable. This wasn't a tantrum, it was theatrical disdain. George didn't just demand excellence, he demanded it obey gravity if it failed. His appetite was notorious. Extravagant meals, experimental dishes, entire courses invented for him. But when disappointed, he wielded his fork like a scepter, and if the food failed to impress, it faced the same fate as his ministers, abrupt dismissal. And while George tossed dry roasts, the next boy king took a different approach to public decency by banning kissing entirely, even at weddings. Edward VI banned kissing in public, including at weddings. Edward VI inherited the throne at 9 and was dead by 15, but in that short window, he managed to kiss goodbye to one of humanity's oldest public gestures. As a devout Protestant reformer in training, Edward sought to reshape England not just politically, but morally. And one target of his righteous reform? Kissing. He found it vulgar, unholy, a slippery slope to sin. Under his rule, public displays of affection, especially kissing, were deemed indecent. Edicts went out, courtiers were warned. Even married couples found themselves chastised for celebrating their nuptials too physically at the altar. Kissing in church was banned. So was kissing in court. Servants were punished for so much as a peck near the palace. Ministers scrambled to reinterpret old wedding customs. "You may now kiss the bride" was temporarily replaced with awkward nods and handshakes. Edward's reasoning? Physical closeness was temptation, and temptation led to corruption. Better to eliminate the gateway entirely. It didn't last long as death brought a flood of lip-locking back into England, but for a brief prudish moment, love had to keep its distance. And while Edward feared contamination by contact, the next monarch dined with gold for just one course and never again. Henry VIII had golden cutlery, but only used it once, due to superstition. Henry VIII didn't do subtle. His tableware glistened like a treasury vault silver goblets, jeweled platters, peacock pies with actual tail feathers. So naturally, golden cutlery seemed like the next step. Commissioned by royal goldsmiths, the set was ornate, heavy, and absurdly valuable. Forks, knives, and spoons all pure gold, carved with lions and Tudor roses, glowing under the chandelier light like utensils forged by the sun. He used it once. After a single meal, the entire set was locked away in a vault. Not because of theft fears or political prudence, but because Henry, the king of superstition and sudden paranoia, became convinced it was cursed. Some said the food tasted wrong. Others whispered he had a vision during the meal, a bad omen, a headache, a stomach cramp, a flicker of guilt. Whatever the trigger, he ordered the gold cutlery never be used again. Some pieces may have been melted down, others disappeared. But the king returned to silver and pewter, content to dine without conjuring whatever doom he imagined hung over that gilded set. And while Henry feared bad luck in gold, his daughter banished bad breath from court, entirely declaring war on garlic for the sake of royal noses. Elizabeth I banned garlic at court, so no one could have peasant breath. Elizabeth I's court sparkled with sophistication. Everything from architecture to etiquette was crafted for elegance down to the very air one exhaled. So when the Queen caught wind, literally, of garlic on the breath of a courtier, she didn't just flinch. She issued a decree. No garlic at court. It wasn't just preference. It was policy. Garlic, in Elizabeth's mind, was peasant, food pungent, uncouth, and totally incompatible with the grace of monarchy. If you wanted to stand in her presence, your breath had to be as polished as your shoes. The ban extended to meals, kitchens, and even foreign guests. Ambassadors were warned in advance. One diplomat reportedly chewed parsley for hours before an audience, just to be safe. The Queen's nose was legendary sharp, sensitive, and utterly unforgiving. And in the perfumed chambers of her court, a whiff of garlic was enough to ruin a career. Her ban was enforced not with public executions, but with quiet banishments and cutting insults. And so the halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court remained garlic-free, while England's finest whispered sweet nothings, laced only with rosewater and flattery. But while Elizabeth gagged at peasant breath, the next king tried to reinvent time, itself adding a day to the week just because he thought it was a good idea. George III tried to invent a new calendar with 8 days a week. Long before the Beatles sang about it, George III dreamed of an 8th day. Not metaphorically, not musically, literally. The king, deep in one of his intellectual fixations, became convinced that the 7-day week was arbitrary. He wanted to improve it, make it more logical, more efficient, more British. His proposal? An 8-day week. The extra day would be used for rest, reflection, or administrative catch-up. Some say he wanted to call it George Day. Others claim it was meant as a gift to God. Whatever the origin, the idea spiraled. Calendars were redrawn by royal mathematicians. Drafts were printed. Even church leaders were consulted who, unsurprisingly, hated it. George, in one of his manic bursts, insisted the current calendar was a Roman relic, outdated and inefficient. He believed his version would revolutionize productivity, aligning commerce, faith, and empire under one rational time grid. But as his mental health declined, so did support for the plan. The proposal was shelved, buried in archives, and mocked in private. Yet, for a flickering moment, Britain stood on the edge of calendrical revolutional, because one king thought 7 wasn't enough. And while George redrew time itself, the next queen found her own version of luck stitched in fur and nestled in her royal sleeves. Queen Anne kept a live ferret in her sleeve for good luck. Queen Anne may have suffered tragic losses and crippling gout, but she had a soft spot for superstition, especially the furry kind. Amid the powdered wigs and royal pageantry, Anne was known to keep a live ferret tucked into the oversized sleeves of her royal gowns. Not a symbol, not a toy. A living, wriggling, whiskered ferret. She called it her lucky charm. The court didn't quite know what to make of it. Ferrets weren't pets fit for a queen. They were wiry, mischievous creatures more barn than ballroom. But Anne adored hers. She fed it treats during meetings. Let it nap in the folds of her gown, and if it poked its head out mid-council, no one dared flinch. The ferret, reportedly named Dapple, became a fixture at court. Superstition or comfort, no one could say for sure. But Anne insisted its presence brought her good fortune ironic, given her life's avalanche of personal tragedy. The animal stayed close through campaigns, ceremonies, even state dinners, because where most monarchs leaned on religion or ritual, Anne trusted paws and claws, and while her luck nestled in silk, the next king demanded something else before battle-note prayer, not strategy, but compliments. Richard III made his soldiers shout compliments at him before battle. Forget fiery speeches or war cries. Richard III had a different way of getting psyched for combat. Before charging into battle, he made his soldiers shout compliments at him, loudly, publicly, enthusiastically. Long live our noble king, strongest in the realm. Your armor blinds the sun. It wasn't optional. Officers ensured every soldier participated. Those who didn't shout with gusto were watched. Those who fumbled their lines found themselves reassigned or mysteriously missing. Richard, ever image-conscious and obsessed with loyalty, needed more than weapons to win wars. He needed adoration. In a world where rebellion brewed like tea and backstabbing was a daily threat, compliments were more than ego fluff. They were security checks. Verbal loyalty oaths disguised as morale-boosting cheers. To his men, it became routine. Draw swords, polish armor, praise the king. The battlefield was theater, and Richard demanded a standing ovation before Act I. But not all cheers saved him. At Bosworth Field, surrounded and betrayed, there were no compliments, only silence and steel. And as Richard died, craving applause, the next monarch would curse his way through life, sermons and royal meetings alike, his foul mouth forever clashing with his crown. William IV, cursed constantly, even during church services. William IV, the Sailor King, brought the manners of the Navy into the halls of Buckingham Palace and with them, a vocabulary that could peel paint. He cursed constantly, colorfully, loudly. It didn't matter if he was addressing Parliament, chatting with servants, or sitting in church. Swearing was his second language. He laced his speeches with obscenities. Blasphemies rolled from his lips mid-sermon. Bishops winced. Courtiers turned pale. Ministers learned to decode his meaning through the barrage of F-bombs and naval slang. No one was spared, not even God, apparently, when William grew frustrated during slow homilies. It wasn't performative anger. It was simply how he spoke. A lifetime in the Royal Navy had hardwired a sailor's tongue into his royal brain, and he saw no need to adjust just because he wore a crown. At times he apologized afterward, sort of. Pardon the bloody language, he'd say, while lighting a cigar inside a royal chapel. Yet, despite the profanity, many found him oddly refreshing. Honest. No frills, no pretense. And while William barked obscenities through stained glass, the next monarch found peace in music, but not the kind anyone else enjoyed. His bagpipes became royal alarm clocks, played badly at dawn. Edward VIII was obsessed with bagpipes and played them badly at 6 a.m. Edward VIII was the kind of monarch who preferred bagpipes to breakfast and made sure everyone around him shared in that preference, whether they liked it or not. Every morning, at the ungodly hour of 6 a.m., he would play the bagpipes. Not well, not softly, with all the delicacy of a goat stomping on a church organ. It started as a queer cone of many, but soon it became routine. Staff would be wrenched from sleep by the sound of Edward's piping echoing through the halls. Guests at royal residences would jolt awake, unsure if they were being serenaded or assaulted. No one dared complain. To question the king's piping was to question his soul. He fancied himself Scottish in spirit, though most Scots would have traded their kilts to make it stop. Edward believed the bagpipes were stirring, ancient, and profoundly masculine. What they were in reality was off-key and relentless. His obsession continued even after his abdication. In exile, he kept his pipes and woke the neighbors instead. And while Edward blew notes with brutal confidence, the next queen was busy rewriting history, starting with her own portraits, which she had youthified well into her senior years. Queen Elizabeth I had her portraits edited to make her look younger, decades after her youth. Queen Elizabeth I understood power, and she knew that nothing threatened power like age. In a world where youth symbolized fertility, vitality, and strength, Elizabeth refused to let the mirror dictate her legacy. So she had her portraits edited over and over, until time itself bent to her will. By the 1590s, the Virgin Queen was well into her 60s, wrinkled, tired, and increasingly reclusive. But her portraits, radiant, ageless, ethereal. Artists were explicitly instructed to omit flaws. No jowls, no gray, no sagging necklines or thinning hair. Instead, alabaster skin, wide eyes, and golden locks untouched by time. One official template called the Mask of Youth was used repeatedly, with minor costume changes, different settings, same ageless face. To the public, Elizabeth remained an immortal icon. To the court, she was a woman waging a quiet war against mortality. Behind closed doors, her ladies knew the truth. The makeup was heavier, the hairpieces more elaborate. But in paint, she was forever frozen in perfection. And while Elizabeth battled age with brushes, the next king enforced youth from above, making his servants kneel just to hand him dessert. Henry VII made his servants kneel when handing him food, even desserts. Henry VII wasn't known for charm, or warmth, or smiling. What he was known for was control-tight, quiet, suffocating control. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the dining room, where even the simple act of serving food became a ritual of submission. Every dish, from roast to pudding, had to be presented by a servant on one knee, not just formal occasions, every meal, even if they were handing him a custard tart. The message was clear. You don't feed the king, you serve him. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about hierarchy. Henry wanted his court to remember at all times who sat above them. Eating became theater, and dessert a lesson in humility. Some servants reportedly developed knee calluses. Others joked very privately about the absurdity of genuflecting to a plate of figs, but no one dared change protocol. The king's gaze was cold, calculating, and quick to punish even the smallest breach of etiquette. His court was a place of whispered terror. Even the plum cake came with pressure. And while Henry enforced submission at the dinner table, his descendant would dine as a deity immortalized, in glowing abs as a Roman god. On canvas, of course, with zero shame. Charles II commissioned a painting of himself as a Roman god. With glowing abs, Charles II never did things halfway, not politics, not pleasure, and certainly not portraiture. In a court famed for revelry and excess, the king decided that being painted in royal robes wasn't nearly grand enough. So he commissioned a portrait of himself as a Roman god complete with flowing robes, laurel wreath, and most memorably, glowing abs. This wasn't just idealized. It was fantasy cosplay. Charles, who was known for his slightly sagging figure and fondness for wine and women, suddenly appeared chiseled from marble. His chest gleamed with divine light. His arms rippled with Olympian strength. The artist, undoubtedly under royal encouragement, painted not the king's body but his ego. The portrait hung proudly in his palace, where it both stunned and amused his courtiers. Some called it satire, others feared it was prophecy. Either way, no one dared mention the difference between canvas Charles and the real, slightly wheezy Charles who preferred lounging with his spaniels over leading troops. But while Charles tried to shine like Apollo, the next monarch's pet had less classical elegance and a whole lot more profanity, shrieking curses in German to horrified guests. Victoria's pet parrot, cursed in German, horrifying guests. Queen Victoria's court was a blend of solemn mourning, rigid etiquette, and sudden bursts of the bizarre. And nothing captured that odd mix better than her pet Perota, seemingly innocent African grey that, to the shock of everyone, cursed fluently in German. The bird had been a gift, possibly from a European noble. It was intelligent, chatty, and quickly absorbed the language of its surroundings. Unfortunately, some of those surroundings included irate German-speaking staff and frustrated royals muttering in moments of stress. The parrot learned the best words, the worst ones, really, and repeated them with theatrical timing. Imagine a quiet tea in the drawing room, foreign dignitaries seated politely, when suddenly, from a perch nearby, a stream of angry guttural obscenities in perfect German. Guests froze. Victoria blushed. One account claims she snapped, "He must have learned it from Prince Albert," and then ordered the bird removed mid-visit. But she didn't get rid of it. The parrot stayed, and cursed, and became a sort of feathered warning sign. Mind your language around the Queen's walls, or it will come back to haunt you. And while Victoria's bird raged in German, the next king would channel his own fury at the breakfast table over something as simple as unsalted eggs. George I had a chef, fired for not salting his eggs enough, and had him whipped. George I ruled England with a thick German accent and an even thicker temper. His rule was pragmatic, dull to some, but his rage? That was operatic, especially when it came to breakfast. One morning he was served his usual boiled egg simple, dependable and royal. But on this day the eggs were bland, no salt, not enough anyway. George tasted them, paused, then exploded, not with words, with consequences. The chef was dragged from the kitchen, accused of high disrespect, and promptly whipped. Not fined, not dismissed, whipped for seasoning failure. This wasn't about taste. It was about power. George believed in discipline, especially from those who fed him. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was loyalty on a plate. If the kitchen faltered, what else might fall apart? Afterward, the court walked on eggshells literally. No one dared tweak a recipe. Dishes were tasted obsessively. Salt became a sacred duty. And in the shadow of that culinary tyranny, the next monarch would be even stranger in his preferences because his hatred didn't target chefs, it targeted fruit. But only the round kind. James I hated round fruit, calling them unnatural. James I was a monarch of contradictions, a devout scholar who obsessed over witchcraft, a peace-loving king with a sharp tongue, and a man with an inexplicable vendetta against fruit. But not just any round fruit. Apples, plums, peaches. If it had curves and a symmetrical shape, James found it suspicious. He called them unnatural, as though the laws of geometry had betrayed divine order. He claimed they reminded him of deceitful planets or witches' tokens. Whether this was an aesthetic revulsion or some mystical paranoia is unclear, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't touch them. He would flinch if offered a perfectly spherical apple. He reportedly once flung a plum from his plate with a sneer, muttering something about devilish smoothness. His servants learned quickly. Court tables were decorated with oblong fruit instead bananas, pears, figs. Oranges had to be pre-sliced. Gardeners were warned not to display baskets with too much roundness. To his guests, it was a curiosity. To James, it was a matter of cosmic balance. He ruled a kingdom and feared curves. And while James banished fruit based on shape, the next queen collected shapes far more sinister: executioner hoods, stacked like trophies of vengeance. Queen Mary I collected executioner hoods as morbid souvenirs. Mary I's obsession with death didn't stop at policy, it extended to decor. While her Protestant victims burned in public squares, Mary curated a far more intimate, chilling collection in private. Executioner hoods. Black, linen, and stained with history, these grim artifacts were reportedly gathered from royal and private executions alike. She didn't display them openly. They were kept in private quarters, rumored to be stored in a locked chest or mounted in an alcove no servant dared linger in. Some claimed she touched them during prayer. Others said she named them. One legend insists she once slept with one under her pillow on the anniversary of a prominent heretic's death. To Mary, these weren't just macabre decorations. They were proof, relics of justice, symbols of triumph over heresy. Each hood represented a soul she had saved, in the only way her brutal theology could understand. Foreign envoys whispered of the collection. Ministers avoided eye contact when the topic surfaced, but no one dared intervene. Mary had made her point. Repentance came in fire, and memory in cloth. And while Mary kept her darkness under lock and key, the next king adorned himself with far lighter fair flower crowns, even at councils of war. Edward II wore flower crowns, even at war councils. Edward II, long criticized for his weak leadership and poor military judgment, had another habit that sent his advisors into quiet despair. He wore flower crowns. Not during feasts or festivals, but during war councils. While knights debated strategy and generals prepared for bloodshed, Edward would appear crowned not in steel, but in daisies, violets, or woven roses plucked fresh and arranged with unsettling care. Sometimes he even added lavender for clarity. Soldiers whispered that their king looked like a woodland nymph summoned to bless the troops with whimsy instead of orders. This wasn't a one-off eccentricity. It was a repeated ritual. Some say it calmed him. Others argue it was a deliberate rejection of martial imagery, a soft rebellion against the expectations of kingship. Whatever his motive, the image stuck, the king with petals on his brow, discussing battle formations. His enemies mocked him. His allies cringed. But Edward was unmoved. He believed nature brought clarity and power, and if that meant appearing at a siege looking like midsummer personified, so be it. And while Edward wrapped himself in blooms, the next monarch armored himself far more aggressively with pants so bedazzled they glittered like a walking fortress. Henry VIII owned a pair of diamond-encrusted armor pants. Henry VIII wasn't content just being a king. He wanted to be a monument. His armor was more than battlefield protection. It was propaganda forged in steel. And among the many suits in his gilded arsenal was a singular, ostentatious creation, a pair of diamond-encrusted armor pants. Yes, armor pants, studded with precious stones. They weren't for war. These weren't built to withstand sword or musket. They were ceremonial, designed to dazzle. Crafted with polished steel, velvet lining, and diamonds sewn along the thighs and codpiece, they gleamed with royal ego. When Henry wore them, he didn't walk shimmered. Court chroniclers whispered that the king strutted in them during royal parades, relishing the gasps and grovels they inspired. They were less protective gear and more wearable treasury. Some said the diamonds were real. Others argued they were polished glass. Either way, the point wasn't wealth, it was dominance. The pants declared, "Look upon me and squint, peasants." And while Henry flexed in rhinestone warwear, the next queen took a more psychological route to supremacy, banishing every mirror from court so no one could dare outshine her reflection. Elizabeth I banned mirrors at court so no one could compare themselves to her. Elizabeth I built her image like a fortress white skin, red lips, towering ruff, every inch calculated, every gaze curated. But beneath that precision was insecurity, and her greatest enemy wasn't foreign invasion, it was mirrors. As she aged, the queen began banning reflective surfaces from court. Not subtly. Entire wings of the palace were stripped. Mirrors in chambers, dressing rooms, and guest quarters vanished like traitors in the night. The reasoning was whispered. Elizabeth didn't want anyone comparing themselves to her. Or worse, witnessing her decline. In a court that lived and died by appearance, this decree struck like thunder. Ladies-in-waiting had to apply makeup by candlelight and guesswork. Foreign visitors were confused, servants frustrated. But no one questioned it. Elizabeth was the sun, and no one looks directly at the sun. Some say she kept a single mirror for private use, heavily guarded and rarely glimpsed. Others believe she relied entirely on attendants to describe her appearance, always with flattery, of course. The Virgin Queen didn't age, not officially, and without mirrors, no one could prove otherwise. And while Elizabeth erased reflections, her great-great-granddaughter upcycled her sterning gowns of grief into household decor fit for a mourning monarch. Queen Victoria's mourning dresses were recycled into curtains. Queen Victoria wore black for 40 years after the death of Prince Albert. Entire wardrobes of crepe, bombazine, and jet beads piled up like a funeral department store. But what do you do with decades worth of sorrow-stitched silk once it's too threadbare to wear? You turn it into curtains. Yes, royal seamstresses were ordered to recycle Victoria's old mourning dresses into drapery. Gowns once worn during solemn audiences and widows' walks now hung in her drawing rooms, framing windows with swaths of grief. Rooms were dressed like coffins. Sunlight filtered through folds of emotional fabric. It wasn't merely thrifty. It was symbolic. The Queen didn't just mourn, Albert, she lived in mourning, literally surrounded by it. Guests would sit beside the folds of her former dresses, unaware that the gloom surrounding them once rustled through palace corridors in funeral processions. Every pleat was personal, every hem historical. And while Victoria decorated her palace with her sorrow, the next king, obsessed not with mourning but with manners so extreme, he made courtiers bow 3 times just for using the bathroom. Richard II demanded courtiers bow 3 times, even if they just left for the bathroom. For Richard II, kingship wasn't just divine, it was theatrical. Every glance, every movement, every breath in his court had to be rehearsed to perfection. And no gesture symbolized this obsession with ceremony more than his demand that courtiers bow 3 times every time they left his presence, including when they were just going to the bathroom. The rules were strict. 1 bow before turning to walk away, a second halfway to the door, and a third just as they exited, preferably with a backward glance of reverence. Even if nature was calling with royal urgency, the bows had to be made. Skipping a bow was no small offense. It was interpreted as sacrilege, disloyalty, or even treason-adjacent arrogance. Some courtiers reportedly developed an entire rhythm to it glide. Pause, bow, repeat. It turned palace movement into ballet. Others simply trained their bladders to avoid the ritual entirely. Richard believed that the rituals reinforced loyalty and elevated the monarchy to the divine, but to everyone else, it was exhausting, awkward, and utterly absurd. And while Richard choreographed bathroom bows, the next king filled his portraits with fur-favoring dogs over dukes in nearly every royal painting. Charles I, with dogs more than people, in official portraits. Charles, I may have lost his head, but before that, he ruled with an eye for art and a heart for dogs. In portrait after portrait commissioned from the finest painters of the day, his canine companions appear beside him. Not as background flourishes, not as royal accessories, as stars. Spaniels, hounds, lapdogs, they were given prime real estate in the compositions, often with more detail and affection than the human subjects. Diplomats were rendered as stiff shadows. His dogs? Lively, expressive, sometimes even center frame. Charles saw dogs as symbols of loyalty, something he prized in a court filled with shifting alliances and subtle betrayals. Where men plotted and whispered, dogs barked and followed. They were the companions he could trust. One particularly famous painting features Charles seated beside a dog, looking straight at the viewer, eyes wide, alert, almost human. It was no accident. That was the king's message. In a world of traitors, his dog was his truest subject. And while Charles found companionship in animals, the next king believed cows were worth more than courtiers because he spoke to them repeatedly, as if they'd respond. George III gave speeches to cows, believing they understood him. George III's mental health was the stuff of tragic legend, spiraling from eccentricity into full-blown delusion. But among the more surreal episodes of his decline was his habit of giving speeches to cows. Long, passionate, articulate addresses delivered not to Parliament, not to courtiers, but to herds of confused livestock. He believed they understood him. In the rolling pastures near Windsor, George would stand at the edge of a field and begin declaiming foreign policy, moral virtue, divine monarchy. The cows would blink slowly, chew grass, and occasionally wander off mid-sentence. Undeterred, the king continued. His addresses were reportedly structured like proper state speeches, complete with rhetorical flourishes and dramatic pauses. Servants trailed behind him, taking notes or pretending to, unsure whether to intervene. Doctors observed quietly, One famously recorded that the cows were the only audience that never challenged him. For George, the fields became his parliament, and the mooing masses his most devoted listeners. And while George III preached to bovines, the next king retreated to bath time, whimsy surrounding himself not with ministers or mistresses, but with rubber ducks that had names. Edward VII had rubber ducks in his bath, which he named. Edward VII, the man who once commissioned a sex chair in Paris and kept Europe's gossip columns afloat, had another, far more innocent indulgence. Rubber ducks, not one or two, an entire fleet, yellow, bobbing, squeaky, and, most importantly, named. His bath became a royal pond of absurdity. Each duck had a name: Admiral Quack, Lord Splasherly, Duchess of Drip, and was reportedly spoken to during bath time like honored guests at a dinner party. He arranged them in precise formations. He gave them voices. And yes, he held full conversations with them while palace staff waited outside, baffled and deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just childhood nostalgia. It was ritual. A way for the overstimulated monarch to unwind in a world he had to constantly perform for. The bath was his safe zone, the ducks, his loyal floating court. No one dared remove them. On one occasion, a housemaid attempted to clean them away. She was reassigned within the week. And while Edward floated in a bubble bath monarchy, the next queen hurled sharp-tongued insults in ancient Latin confident that her foreign guests would never catch on. Elizabeth I sometimes insulted ambassadors in Latin so they wouldn't know. Elizabeth I, linguistic prodigy and political chess master, knew how to turn a phrase and, when necessary, weaponize it. Fluent in multiple languages, she often spoke to foreign ambassadors with dazzling fluency. But when they crossed her, or tried to outwit her, she had a secret weapon: Latin insults to their faces. She would lace diplomatic responses with veiled jabs, slipped casually into classical Latin, often delivered with a polite smile and a tone as smooth as silk. Most ambassadors, eager to impress and avoid offense, nodded along, none the wiser. Only later, perhaps with a translator's help, did they realize they had just been compared to a goat, a fool, or a parasite. Sometimes the insults were theatrical, other times razor-sharp and clinical. She referred to one envoy's argument as empty air expelled by an overfed bladder, in Latin, of course. He left the court beaming. The brilliance of it was timing. Elizabeth never exploded, never raised her voice. She wrapped her insults in golden syntax and classical authority. And while Elizabeth sliced with syntax, the next queen read omens into everyday thing 7 sneezes, which she believed were messages straight from hell. Mary, I believed sneezes were demonic messages. Mary, I wasn't just devout, she was obsessively spiritual, interpreting every twitch of the world around her through a lens of divine signs and infernal warnings. And in this worldview, sneezes weren't just bodily reactions, they were demonic messages, whispers from the devil himself. She flinched when someone sneezed. She once delayed a council meeting for nearly an hour after 3 sneezes occurred in succession. Servants were questioned. Rooms were inspected. One minister was nearly dismissed after sneezing twice during a proposal about church land. According to palace whispers, Mary believed that sneezes were omens, warnings that something unholy lurked nearby. In a few cases, letters were burned unread simply because someone sneezed as they were handed over. The act of sneezing near the queen became a serious faux pas. Ministers carried handkerchiefs like holy shields. Coughing was safer. Her paranoia stretched to the chapel. A priest once sneezed during Mass and was quietly removed from court 3 days later. No explanation, just vanished. For Mary, Every inhale came with risk. Every exhale might be a portal. And while she feared the invisible, the next monarch doused himself in scent so pungent it made his courtiers dizzy. William II wore perfume so strong it made courtiers dizzy. William II, also known as William Rufus, was not known for subtlety in any form, least of all his scent. While most kings bathed rarely and wore cologne sparingly, William turned himself into a walking cloud of fragrance, a sensory battering ram that hit courtiers the moment he entered a room. His perfume was so intense it made people lightheaded, dizzy, occasionally nauseated. The scent was said to be floral with heavy musk, mixed with exotic oils imported from the East. Rather than dab, William doused, layers upon layers. Some reports claimed he reapplied midday, fearing that the aroma of power might fade. Others whispered that he used perfume as a political tool, an olfactory show of force. Standing next to him at court was a challenge. Courtiers learned to breathe shallowly. Ambassadors discreetly covered their noses with lace. One noble reportedly fainted after a prolonged audience. William considered it necessary a king should be larger than life, and smell like it too. Subtlety was for peasants. Royalty, he believed, should overwhelm every sense. And while William assaulted the nose, the next king soothed his troubled sleep with something equally potent, candies laced with opium, served like bedtime bonbons. George IV ate opium candies to help him sleep. George IV wasn't just a gourmand, he was a medicated gourmand. Amid the lavish dinners, mountains of roast meats, and oceans of wine, he also indulged in something sweeter and far more dangerous: opium candies, a delicacy to some, a necessity to him. Wrapped like innocent confections, these candied treats were infused with opium, meant to calm the nerves and, more importantly, knock the king into unconsciousness. George suffered from anxiety, gout, and a cocktail of royal maladies, and he refused to tolerate insomnia. So every evening, he reached for his nightly fix. One candy became 2, then 3. Eventually, he couldn't sleep without them. Doctors warned him. Ministers ignored it. Servants were told to always have them ready beside his bed, stacked neatly on a silver tray, like poison masquerading as dessert. The candies dulled his pain, but they also dulled his mind. His public appearances became sluggish, his speeches rambling. Behind closed doors, he sometimes forgot who he was addressing, or what century it was, but he slept. And for a king haunted by pressure and poor health, that was enough. And while George sought refuge in opiates, the next monarch surrendered to opera, where he cried like a child every single time, no matter the plot. Edward VIII cried at the opera every time, regardless of the plot. Edward VIII, the famously romantic king who gave up his crown for love, had one other emotional Achilles heel: opera. But not just tragic arias or doomed heroinescence opera. Comic, tragic, historicalite didn't matter. Within minutes of curtain rise, Edward would be quietly weeping. Tears streamed down his cheeks with mechanical regularity. Acti, sniffles. By the finale, full-on silent sobbing. His handkerchiefs were embroidered for the specific purpose. Staff called them weep rags. He carried several to each performance, dabbing discreetly while trying to keep up royal composure. The odd part? The plot didn't matter. He once cried through a satirical opera about ducks. Another time, he broke down during a light-hearted performance that involved singing vegetables. No deaths. No tragedy, just vegetables. Some say it was the music. Others blamed a fragile emotional core cracked under the weight of royal expectation. But one thing was clear: Edward didn't just watch, Opera hay felt it, intensely, every time. Courtiers grew accustomed to it. Guests whispered behind fans, but Edward never stopped attending, nor did he stop crying. And while he soaked handkerchiefs at the theater, the next monarch started his day like a Tudor tyrant with pheasant, ale, and 10 courses before breakfast even ended. Henry VIII had a 10-course breakfast, including ale and pheasant. Henry VIII didn't nibble, he devoured. From court politics to church doctrine, he consumed everything with a legendary appetite, and nowhere was this more literal than at his breakfast table. While modern mortals might start the day with toast and tea, Henry greeted the morning with a 10-course meal that could feed a small army, and probably did. On a typical day, his breakfast included pheasantieres, pheasantas, as well as beef, lamb, eggs, pies, fish, and an assortment of pastries. It wasn't just about quantity. It was about dominance. Eating lavishly in the early hours sent a message. I am the king, and I rise with meat in my mouth and beer in my belly. Ale flowed like water. Fruit was optional. Grease was not. Doctors winced. Courtiers blinked in disbelief, but the kitchens obeyed. Each morning they rolled out dishes that would make a modern buffet blush. It was said that Henry once threw a tantrum because his roast swan wasn't crispy enough at 8 a.m. This breakfast wasn't fuel, it was theater. And while Henry feasted like a barbarian king, his daughter once turned the tables, forcing her entire court to dress like peasants, just for laughs. Elizabeth I once made her court dress as peasants, just to mock them. Elizabeth I loved spectacle, but she also had a cruel sense of humor and a ruthless taste for humiliation. One day, amid the usual parade of silks and diamonds, she issued an order that baffled her court. Dress like peasants. Not for charity, not for diplomacy, but for mockery. Her nobles, usually decked in jewels and perfumed fabrics, were forced to don scratchy linen, mud-splattered boots, and potato sacks belted with rope, hair undone, faces unpainted, jewelry forbidden. When they entered court dressed this way, Elizabeth seated on her throne in full regalia aloft, hard. According to witnesses, she pointed at some of her most powerful lords and declared, "Now you look as you feel." The court, humiliated but unable to protest, played along. They curtsied in rags, they bowed in straw hats. It was both performance art and a power move. Elizabeth reminded everyone, no matter how rich or beautiful you thought you were, your status was borrowed and could be revoked in a single royal whim. It was a day of dress-up that left psychological bruises. And while Elizabeth toyed with fashion and pride, the next monarch toyed with vegetables by literally knighting a turnip. No, really. George III knighted a turnip as a joke no one laughed. George III's madness has many chapters, but one of the strangest involved a vegetable, a sword, and a very confused kitchen servant. During one of his infamous mental spirals, he knighted a turnip, as in Sir Turnip. It began during a dinner when the king reportedly became enamored with the root vegetable on his plate. He held it up, turned it slowly in his hand, and declared it more noble than half the lords. Then, with a flourish, he drew a ceremonial sword and tapped it on the turnip's shoulders, proclaiming, "Rise, Sir Turnip." The room froze. Ministers looked to each other. No one laughed. Because it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. Here was the ruler of an empire, elevating a root vegetable with more ceremony than he'd shown to actual nobles. Servants said the king even requested that Sir Turnip be preserved. It was later found rotting in a linen drawer, wrapped in silk. This wasn't satire, it was symptomatic. George III's mind was unraveling in front of his courtiers, and they were powerless to stop it. And as George knighted his turnip, the next queen turned her grief into cloud-watching, filling her diary with sky-gazing sorrow. Victoria's diary included 18 entries about clouds. Queen Victoria ruled over an empire that stretched across continents, but her gaze often drifted upward to the sky. Not in poetic daydreaming or idle weather notes, but with the focused melancholy of a woman who never fully escaped her grief. Her private diaries, voluminous, meticulous, and deeply personal, contain at least 18 entries solely about clouds. Not political clouds, literal clouds. Their shape, their movement, their resemblance to Albert's face or God's veil or the fading memory of youth. Some days she described them as ghostly ships adrift in the ether. Other times, soft as sorrow and slow as time. The language is intimate, nearly sacred. Her observations were not idle musings, they were meditations on mourning. Watching clouds became an emotional ritual, a way to commune with the only realm Albert might still occupy. She didn't just write about them, she timed her walks by them, chose her sitting rooms based on sky visibility, and even refused to close certain curtains on cloud-worthy days. Where other monarchs found comfort in ritual or religion, Victoria found it in vapor shifting, intangible, beautiful, and always out of reach. And while Victoria watched the skies, the next king sought status with something even more surreal, a sapphire tooth fit for a medieval Bond villain. Richard III had a tooth made of sapphire, though it broke while biting into venison. Richard III's skeletal remains told us many things: his curved spine, his battle wounds, his brutal death. But one lesser-known, deeply bizarre detail came from whispers in the annals of noble gossip, a tale of vanity, vengeance, and one incredibly ambitious dental decision. Richard, it said, once had a tooth made of sapphire. Yes, Sophia, embedded right in his royal grin. Why? Vanity, likely. Symbolism, perhaps. The blue stone was associated with wisdom, nobility, and divine favor. Or maybe Richard simply wanted something that no other monarch dared to possess: a jewel inside his face. The tooth sparkled, quite literally. It caught the light at court, unnerving enemies and dazzling allies, but it wasn't built for durability. During a particularly vigorous feast, the story goes, Richard bit down on a piece of venison too tough for even his gemstone to handle. The sapphire cracked, the tooth shattered, the king roared not in pain, but in fury. For days he refused to show his face. Some said he ordered the tooth buried like a fallen knight. And so ended the reign of the world's first and last jewel-toothed monarch. But behind that last grin lies the final haunting question. What else have the kings and queens of England taken to their graves beneath velvet, gold, and a legacy of madness?